I am Maya, 35 years old, and my family thought they had me perfectly figured out. At my stepsister Chloe's lavish rehearsal dinner, she clinked her crystal glass and pointed to the back of the room where they had deliberately hidden me away. "This is my stepsister Maya," she announced to 36 VIP guests. "She is just a nurse, so if anyone chokes on a crab cake tonight, she has got you covered." My biological father burst out laughing. My stepmother smirked into her wine glass. I simply continued cutting my steak, my expression perfectly composed, because they had no idea that within moments, the groom's billionaire father would stand up, look directly at me, and deliver a truth that would freeze the entire room and shatter their carefully constructed facade forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the disrespect of people who desperately underestimate your worth. The Oakwood Country Club smelled of old money, imported white orchids, and quiet condescension. It was the kind of place where the waitstaff wore white gloves and the chandeliers looked heavy enough to crush a luxury car. This was the world the Davenport family inhabited naturally. Julian Davenport, the groom, was a wealthy white man whose family name was practically stamped on half the hospital wings and corporate buildings in the state. My stepsister Chloe had spent the last 3 years contorting herself into the perfect high society bride to fit into his world. Tonight was her ultimate performance. My stepmother Brenda and my biological father Tyrone were playing their parts flawlessly. They sat at the head table draped in expensive fabrics that I suspected were purchased on credit, laughing a little too loudly at Harrison Davenport's jokes. Harrison was Julian's father, an intimidating titan in the national healthcare logistics industry. He commanded the room without even trying. Tyrone and Brenda were trying far too hard. I was seated at table 12. Table 12 was a small, unsteady circle positioned directly next to the swinging kitchen doors. Every time a waiter rushed out with a tray of roasted asparagus or filet mignon, a gust of cold air carrying the scent of dish soap washed over me. I was seated with Julian's distant great-aunt, who was hard of hearing, and a cousin who spent the entire evening looking at his phone. I was placed there by design. Brenda handled the seating chart, and she wanted to make sure I knew exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. Out of sight, out of mind, and only present because it would look strange to the Davenports if the bride's older stepsister was entirely absent. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and watched the dynamic unfold. I was 35, a former emergency room nurse, and I had long ago stopped seeking validation from the people at the head table. But the sheer audacity of their performance was something to behold. Tyrone was playing the role of the proud, successful patriarch, nodding approvingly at Chloe. This was the same man who had stood by silently when Brenda kicked me out of the house at 18 with nothing but 2 trash bags of clothes and my nursing school textbooks. He had watched me work night shifts to keep a roof over my head while he paid for Chloe's designer bags and European vacations. A sharp clinking sound pulled my attention back to the front of the room. Chloe was standing tapping a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. At 28, she was the undisputed golden child of our blended family. She wore a tailored silk dress that clung perfectly to her frame, her hair professionally styled into loose waves. The room of 36 VIP guests quieted down, turning their attention to the glowing bride. Chloe smiled a practiced, camera-ready expression. She began her toast by gushing over Julian, recounting the story of how they met in an upscale coffee shop downtown. She moved on to praise Harrison and Julian's mother, thanking them excessively for welcoming her into their incredible family with such open arms. She spoke about the blending of 2 strong, successful families, casting Tyrone and Brenda as paragons of hard work and achievement. The Davenports nodded politely, sipping their wine. Then Chloe's gaze shifted. She scanned the room, looking past the elegant floral centerpieces, past the wealthy in-laws, right to the back corner, where the kitchen doors swung on their hinges. She found me. I saw the glint in her eye before she even opened her mouth. It was the same look she gave me when I was 20, coming home exhausted from a 12-hour shift at the hospital, while she lounged by the pool complaining about her allowance. She thrived on making me the punchline to elevate herself. And of course, we cannot forget my extended family, Chloe announced, her voice projecting clearly through the microphone. She pointed a manicured finger directly at table 12. That is my stepsister Maya way in the back. She gave a little theatrical wave. She is just a nurse, so do not worry, everyone. If anyone chokes on a crab cake tonight, she has got you covered. The delivery was coded in a sugary, playful tone, but the poison underneath was unmistakable. The room erupted into laughter. It was not gentle, polite laughter. It was the kind of hearty, amused laughter reserved for a good joke told at someone else's expense. The Davenports chuckled comfortably, the groomsmen snickered, but the sound that cut through the room, the sharpest, came from the head table. Tyrone. My biological father threw his head back and burst out laughing. He slapped his hand on the table, highly amused by the public degradation of his oldest daughter. Next to him, Brenda did not even bother to hide her satisfaction. She took a slow sip of her red wine, her lips curling into a triumphant smirk as she met my eyes across the distance. They were putting me in my place. They were showing the Davenports that while Chloe was a prize, I was merely the blue-collar help they gracefully tolerated out of charity. A younger version of myself might have crumbled. A 20-year-old Maya might have stood up, face burning with humiliation, and fled through the kitchen doors with tears stinging her eyes. A younger Maya would have spent the drive back to her tiny apartment, wondering why she was so unlovable, why her own father found her struggles amusing. But I was not that girl anymore. I was a 35-year-old woman who had built an empire out of the ashes of their rejection. I did not flush. I did not look away. I did not drop my gaze. I simply picked up my silver knife and fork, sliced a perfectly square piece of my steak, and placed it in my mouth. I chewed slowly, maintaining eye contact with Chloe, until her confident smile faltered just a fraction of an inch. The laughter in the room began to die down as guests turned back to their meals, the brief entertainment of my existence already fading from their minds. I could hear Brenda's voice carrying over the ambient noise of the room. She was leaning over to speak to one of Julian's aunts seated nearby. Maya has always been our little blue-collar worker, Brenda said loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. We tried to push her toward bigger things, but some people are just content staying exactly where they are. Bless her heart. The aunt nodded sympathetically, murmuring something about the nobility of essential workers. I took a sip of my water, letting the cool liquid wash down my throat. The irony was so rich it was almost tangible. Brenda and Tyrone truly believed the narrative they had constructed. They needed to believe it to justify their own choices. They needed me to be the struggling, exhausted nurse to make Chloe's pampered life look like a hard-earned triumph. They had no idea that I had not worked a clinical floor shift in over 4 years. They had no idea about the software logistics company I had founded in my cramped living room after noticing the glaring inefficiencies in the hospital supply chain during the pandemic. They had no idea because I had deliberately kept my life completely separate from their toxic orbit. I showed up to obligatory family events, dressed simply, spoke vaguely about working in healthcare, and let them project whatever insecurities they needed onto me. It kept them out of my bank accounts and out of my business. I watched Chloe sit back down, linking her arm through Julian's, looking immensely pleased with herself. She had established the hierarchy for her new in-laws. She was the star, and I was the unfortunate relative they generously allowed to attend. I glanced at my watch. It was a modest-looking timepiece, unbranded, but mechanically intricate and extremely rare. It was 8:15 in the evening. I decided I would stay for exactly 30 more minutes, just long enough to fulfill the minimum requirement of social etiquette before I returned to my penthouse downtown. I was just about to motion for a waiter to clear my plate when the atmosphere in the room shifted abruptly. The comfortable hum of conversation ceased. I looked toward the front of the room. Harrison Davenport, the patriarch of the family, had stood up from the head table. He did not tap his glass. He did not reach for a microphone. He just stood there, tall and imposing in his bespoke suit, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He ignored Chloe entirely. He stepped away from the head table and began walking down the center aisle of the dining room. The guests watched him in silence, wondering what the billionaire was doing. He walked past the groomsmen, past the extended family, past the towering floral arrangements. He walked straight toward the swinging kitchen doors. He stopped directly in front of table 12. Harrison Davenport looked down at me, his sharp blue eyes widening in sudden absolute recognition. He stood there for a long moment, the silence in the room stretching until it felt like a physical weight. Then his voice cut through the quiet, carrying easily across the opulent space. "Wait," he said, his tone a mixture of shock and profound respect. "You are Maya Washington." I set my napkin on the table and looked up at him. "Yes, Mr. Davenport," I replied, my voice steady and calm. "It is a pleasure to formally meet you outside the boardroom." Harrison turned his head slowly, looking back at the head table where Chloe, Brenda, and Tyrone were watching with identical expressions of complete confusion. Harrison's voice boomed through the quiet country club, laced with an undeniable edge of authority and disbelief. "She is not just a nurse," Harrison announced to the frozen room. "This woman is the founder and CEO of Apex Medical Solutions. She holds the logistics patent that just saved my entire hospital network from bankruptcy last quarter." The air was completely sucked out of the room. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the cool wood against my spine, and watched the dominoes begin to fall. The laughter from the head table finally subsided into a self-satisfied hum. Brenda leaned across her untouched plate of sea bass and locked eyes with a woman I recognized from the seating chart as Julian's Aunt Eleanor. Eleanor was draped in understated cashmere, radiating the kind of quiet generational wealth that Brenda spent every waking hour desperately trying to imitate. "Oh, do not mind, Maya," Brenda said, her voice projecting just enough to carry over the clinking of expensive crystal and silver forks. "She has always been our little blue-collar worker. We are just so proud she managed to find steady employment at the hospital. It takes a certain kind of person to handle bedpans and bodily fluids all day." Eleanor offered a polite but confused smile, clearly uncomfortable with the public shaming. I simply kept my focus on my meal. I did not grip my knife tighter. I did not glare across the room. My phone vibrated against my leg in the pocket of my tailored trousers. I slipped the device out and rested it on my lap out of sight. It was an urgent email from my chief operating officer requiring my final approval on a corporate merger that would expand our software distribution across 3 new state lines. I typed a swift and decisive response, completely unfazed by the spectacle happening 20 feet away. Tyrone chuckled, adjusting his bright silk tie and turning his attention to Julian's uncle at the adjacent table. "It takes all kinds to make the world go round," Tyrone boomed, making sure his deep voice commanded the attention of the room. "You know how it is. We had to practice some serious tough love with Maya. We pushed her out of the nest the day she turned 18. It was the hardest thing I ever had to do as a father, but it was the absolute best thing for her. Taught her how the real world works. You cannot coddle a child who lacks natural ambition." He spoke with the polished conviction of a man who actually believed his own lies. He conveniently neglected to mention the harsh reality of that night. I was not pushed out of the nest to learn independence. I was thrown out onto the street because I refused to hand over my late mother's modest life insurance policy so Brenda could remodel her kitchen with imported Italian marble. I walked out of that house with exactly 2 sets of hospital scrubs, a bus pass, and a duffel bag. I spent my first 2 years of nursing school sleeping on a friend's sagging couch and eating whatever cafeteria food was left over at the end of my grueling night shifts. Meanwhile, Tyrone had purchased Chloe a brand new European convertible for her high school graduation. He paid her full tuition to an outrageously expensive private university, funding a lifestyle of designer clothes and lavish spring breaks in Cabo. They had handed Chloe the world on a silver platter while actively trying to hold my head underwater, and now they were using my survival as proof of their excellent parenting. "Hey, Maya!" Chloe called out, her voice slicing through the ambient noise of the dining room. She was leaning over her sweetheart table, a picture of bridal perfection in her custom gown. "Did you make sure to park in the back lot? The valet needs the front circle clear for the luxury vehicles. We do not want your old sedan ruining the aesthetic when the photographer takes exterior shots later tonight." A few people in this wedding party snickered into their drinks. I swallowed a perfectly cooked piece of steak, dabbed the corners of my mouth with a white linen napkin, and met her gaze directly. I do not have a car here, I replied evenly. I took a private car service. Brenda let out a theatrical, exaggerated sigh, shaking her head as if I were a tragic charity case. See how she wastes her money, Brenda announced to the surrounding tables, throwing her hands up in mock defeat. This is exactly why she is always struggling to make ends meet. I tell her constantly, Maya, you need to budget better on a nurse's salary. You cannot afford private drivers, but she never listens to reason. We almost did not invite her tonight, Eleanor, but Tyrone insisted. Family is family even when they cannot keep up with our lifestyle. I locked my phone screen and placed it back in my pocket. The irony in the room was so dense it was almost suffocating. Brenda was sitting there in a rented gown, wearing jewelry she was undoubtedly paying off on a high-interest credit card, lecturing me about financial responsibility. She was desperate to prove to the Davenports that she belonged in their exclusive tax bracket. She needed me to be the poor, struggling relative to make her own fabricated wealth look legitimate. Aunt Eleanor turned to me, her eyes filled with genuine pity. Nursing must be terribly exhausting work, dear, she said softly. It taught me everything I needed to know about surviving under extreme pressure. I answered with a polite, measured smile. It taught me how to triage emergencies, how to stay completely calm in chaos, and how to recognize when a situation is critical and when it is just noise. I looked directly at Brenda and Chloe as I said the last word. Chloe rolled her eyes and turned her attention back to Julian, whispering something in his ear that made him laugh. Tyrone raised his glass of red wine, loudly toasting to his own fictional success and the merging of two powerful, wealthy families. They were entirely wrapped up in their performance, absolutely certain of their social superiority. They sat there glowing with arrogance, convinced that I was small, insignificant, and entirely beneath them. I checked my watch. The hands swept silently across the custom face. I decided I would endure exactly 10 more minutes of this absurd charade before quietly exiting through the lobby. I had a morning flight to Zurich for a global health summit, and I had already wasted enough time humoring their delusions. I reached for my water glass, perfectly content to let them live in their fantasy world for the rest of the evening. But fate had a much more spectacular plan. The universe was about to violently correct the power dynamic in this room, and I would not have to lift a single finger to make it happen. The silence that followed Harrison Davenport's declaration was not just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that swallowed every ounce of air in the dining room. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. The waitstaff who had been bustling around refilling water glasses and clearing salad plates froze in their tracks. Julian's great aunt, who had been complaining about the draft near our table, stared at me with her mouth slightly open. The sheer magnitude of Harrison's words hung in the space between us, demanding to be processed by a room full of people who had just spent the last 20 minutes treating my existence as a casual punchline. At the head table, the color drained from Chloe's face so rapidly I thought she might actually faint. Her perfect camera-ready posture crumbled. She looked at her new father-in-law, then at me, her eyes darting back and forth as if trying to decipher a complex optical illusion. She let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh that echoed awkwardly against the silent walls. Mr. Davenport. She started, her voice shaking slightly as she gripped the edges of her sweetheart table. I think there has been some kind of misunderstanding. Maya is a nurse. She works at the public hospital downtown. She does not own a company. You must have her confused with someone else. Harrison did not even turn to look at his future daughter-in-law. His focus remained entirely on me. He took another step toward table 12, completely ignoring the frantic energy radiating from the bridal party. There is no misunderstanding, Chloe Harrison said, his voice dropping into that serious, gravelly tone reserved for executive boardrooms. I spent the last 3 months negotiating a licensing deal with Apex Medical Solutions. I know exactly who the founder is. I have read her case studies. I have seen her federal audits. I have looked at her photograph in our corporate briefings. He extended a hand toward me. Maya Washington is the reason Davenport Medical did not have to shutter 3 of our regional clinics this year. The clatter of heavy silver hitting fine china echoed from the head table. Tyrone had literally dropped his fork. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. Brenda, however, went into immediate survival mode. Her entire social standing was currently resting on a razor wire, and she knew it. She stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She smoothed the front of her expensive dress and projected her voice pasting on a bright, desperate smile. "Oh, Harrison, please!" Brenda called out, waving her hand dismissively as she practically power-walked around the head table toward us. Maya has always had a very active imagination. She likes to exaggerate her little side hustles to us. You know how young people are these days with their apps and their startups. It is just a little project she runs from her laptop. We are very supportive, of course, but let us not overshadow Chloe and Julian's special night with tall tales. Harrison finally turned his head to look at Brenda. The expression on his face was one of profound distaste, the way one might look at a persistent insect. "A side hustle," Brenda Harrison repeated, testing the words as if they offended him. He shook his head slowly. "I do not consider a corporate entity that was just valued at $85 million by Forbes to be a side hustle. I do not consider a proprietary software that streamlines critical organ transplant logistics across the entire eastern seaboard to be a little project. Maya Washington is a titan in our industry. $85 million. Harrison spoke the number with absolute clarity. He did not yell. He did not need to. The sheer weight of that figure hit the room like a physical shockwave. Tyrone choked on his breath, a violent coughing fit, seizing him as he reached blindly for his water glass. Brenda stopped dead in her tracks, halfway between the head table and my seat. Her face turned an unflattering shade of mottled red. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Chloe slowly sank back into her chair, her eyes wide, staring at me, as if I had suddenly grown a second head. The narrative they had so carefully constructed, the story of Maya, the struggling, bitter blue-collar stepsister, shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of their eyes. I did not gloat. I did not smile triumphantly. I simply maintained the composed, professional demeanor that had earned me my seat in rooms far more intimidating than this country club. I stood up from the unsteady table near the kitchen doors. I smoothed the front of my tailored trousers and extended my hand to Harrison. "It is truly an honor to meet you in person, Mr. Davenport," I said, keeping my voice modulated and completely steady. "Your team has been incredible to work with. I am very much looking forward to finalizing the integration of our software into your southern facilities next quarter." Harrison took my hand, his grip firm and respectful. "The honor is entirely mine, Maya. When my procurement director told me who was behind the Apex algorithm, I was astounded. To transition from frontline emergency nursing to developing a national logistics infrastructure is nothing short of brilliant. We owe you a massive debt of gratitude." He gestured to the empty chair beside me, the one meant for a +1 I had not bothered to bring. "May I sit for a moment? I would love to hear your thoughts on the recent supply chain disruptions in the Midwest." "Please do," I replied, gesturing to the chair. Harrison Davenport, the man who was paying for this entire extravagant weekend, turned his back on his son, his future daughter-in-law, and the head table. He pulled out the cheap wooden chair at table 12 and sat down next to me. The power dynamic in the room flipped so violently, it caused literal whiplash. The Davenport guests, the executives, the wealthy aunts and uncles who had spent the evening ignoring my existence, suddenly realized that the most powerful, influential person in the room was not sitting at the head table. She was sitting by the kitchen doors. Within minutes, the awkward silence broke, replaced by a frantic, buzzing energy. But the attention was no longer directed at the bride. A man I recognized as a prominent pharmaceutical CEO stood up from a nearby table and approached me, holding out a sleek business card. "Maya," he said, his tone dripping with newfound respect. "I have been following your company's growth. We need to schedule a meeting. A woman who sat on the board of a major medical supplier followed suit, introducing herself and asking for my contact information. Soon, a small crowd of influential people had gathered around table 12, eager to network, to introduce themselves, to bask in the glow of the $85 million revelation. Through the entire spectacle, I kept my composure absolute. I spoke eloquently about market trends, software scalability, and healthcare administration. I shook hands. I accepted business cards. And I completely, totally, and ruthlessly ignored my family. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Tyrone and Brenda hovering on the edge of the crowd that had formed around me. They were desperate to insert themselves into the conversation. They wanted to claim me. They wanted to show these billionaires that they were the proud parents of a tech CEO. Tyrone finally managed to push his way through two hospital administrators. He placed a heavy, sweating hand on my shoulder. "We are just so incredibly proud of her," Tyrone announced to the group, his voice booming with forced joviality. "We always knew Maya was destined for greatness. I taught her everything she knows about business. Hard work, dedication, that is the Washington family way." I did not flinch. I calmly reached up, took Tyrone's hand off my shoulder, and placed it back at his side. I turned to look at him, my expression blank, devoid of any daughterly affection. "I am sorry, Tyrone," I said, keeping my voice loud enough for the surrounding executives to hear. "I was under the impression you kicked me out of your house at 18 because my ambition was a financial burden. I built my company alone. Now, if you will excuse me, I am in the middle of a discussion regarding international shipping logistics with Mr. Davenport." Tyrone recoiled as if I had physically struck him. The executives around us exchanged knowing, uncomfortable glances. Harrison Davenport looked from Tyrone to me, his sharp eyes calculating the toxic family dynamic with ruthless efficiency. Brenda, sensing the absolute social disaster unfolding, grabbed Tyrone's arm and practically dragged him back toward the head table. Chloe was sitting there with tears pooling in her eyes, her perfect rehearsal dinner ruined not by a screaming match, but by the undeniable crushing weight of my success. I turned back to Harrison, picked up my glass of sparkling water, and seamlessly resumed our conversation about supply chain management, leaving my family to drown in their own humiliation. The rest of the rehearsal dinner transformed into my own personal networking event entirely at the expense of Chloe's spotlight. Every time I took a bite of my meal, another Davenport board member or hospital affiliate was standing by my shoulder, offering a firm handshake and asking for my business card. I handled each introduction with practiced grace, speaking about quarterly projections and logistical scalability, while my biological family watched from the head table in a state of quiet, simmering rage. Julian looked incredibly uncomfortable. He kept glancing between his father, who was deeply engaged in a conversation with me about automated medical supply tracking, and Chloe, who was violently shredding a linen napkin under the table. The illusion she had sold him of being the wealthy, cultured daughter of a successful patriarch was rapidly disintegrating. Tyrone and Brenda had been exposed not just as liars, but as small-minded people who had completely misjudged the most successful person in their own family. When the dinner finally concluded, I did not stay for the forced pleasantries or the obligatory group photos. I politely excused myself, thanked Harrison Davenport for his time, and made my way through the country club lobby toward the waiting car. I could feel Brenda's eyes burning a hole between my shoulder blades as I walked out the double doors, but I did not give them the satisfaction of a backward glance. I arrived back at the luxury hotel where the wedding party was staying. I had booked a corner suite on the top floor, entirely separate from the block of rooms Brenda had organized for the rest of the family. I unlocked my door, stepped out of my heels, and poured myself a glass of mineral water. I was just untying the silk belt of my trousers when a frantic, heavy pounding echoed against my suite door. It was not a polite knock. It was the aggressive, entitled pounding of people who believed they owned my time. I set my glass down, walked to the door, and pulled it open. Tyrone, Brenda, and Chloe stood in the hallway. They pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, stepping into my suite with a frantic, aggressive energy. Chloe's eyes were red-rimmed, and her makeup was visibly smudged. Brenda was breathing heavily, her face still flushed with indignation. Tyrone immediately took his stance in the center of my living room, puffing out his chest, as if he were still the undisputed authority figure in my life. "You could have warned us," Tyrone barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You sat there all these years, letting us think you were just scraping by at the hospital. You humiliated us tonight, Maya. You made your mother and me look like fools in front of the people who are about to become our family." I leaned against the heavy oak door, leaving it slightly open, and crossed my arms. "I did not make you look like anything, Tyrone," I said calmly. "I simply existed. You are the ones who chose to use my existence as a punchline for your new friends." "It is not my fault," the punchline hit back. Brenda stepped forward, her voice dropping into a sickeningly sweet, manipulative register that she always used when she was about to demand something outrageous. "Now, Maya, let us not do this," Brenda coaxed, waving her hands as if physically brushing away the tension. "We are a family. We might have had our misunderstandings in the past, but we pushed you hard because we saw your potential. We gave you the tough love you needed to build that company. You owe your drive to us. We are the reason you are sitting on $85 million. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air. She was actually trying to claim credit for the empire I built after she threw me onto the street. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I looked her directly in the eyes and offered a cold, deadpan smile. "You threw me out with 2 trash bags because I refused to give you my dead mother's life insurance money," I reminded her, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "Do not confuse your financial abuse with motivational parenting. Now, why are you really in my room? Get to the point before I call security." Chloe stepped forward, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "My wedding is ruined because of you," she hissed, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "Julian's father will not even look at me. He thinks we are white trash who lied about our money. And worse, Harrison is refusing to pay the overage on the wedding vendors." Tyrone cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. He puffed out his chest again. "The wedding is currently $150,000 over budget," he announced, as if presenting me with a minor administrative error. "The florists, the custom lighting, the imported champagne. Harrison Davenport was supposed to cover the excess, but he pulled his funding this evening after that little stunt you pulled. He said we needed to learn financial responsibility. So you are going to write a check, Maya. You are going to fix this." I stared at him, genuinely fascinated by the depth of his delusion. "You want me to write you a check for $150,000 to pay for a wedding you just spent the entire evening using to humiliate me?" I asked. "Family shares their blessings," Brenda interjected sharply, dropping the sweet act entirely. "You have more money than you know what to do with. You owe us for putting a roof over your head when you were a child. You are going to write that check tonight, or we are going to have a very serious problem." I let out a short, sharp laugh. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of absolute finality. "I am not giving you a single dime," I stated clearly. "I do not care if the florists walk out. I do not care if you have to serve tap water instead of champagne. You built this financial trap, and you are going to sit in it." Chloe let out a shriek of pure rage. "You are just jealous," she screamed, her face contorting into an ugly mask of entitlement. "You have always been jealous of me. You are a bitter, lonely workaholic, and you are trying to sabotage my marriage because no one will ever love you. If you do not pay for this wedding, I will tell Julian and Harrison that your company is a total scam. I will tell them you are a fraud. I will ruin your reputation before you even sign that contract with them." I pushed off the doorframe and walked slowly toward Chloe. She instinctively took a step back, shrinking under my gaze. I stopped 2 feet away from her, towering over her in my bare feet. "I dare you," I whispered, my voice laced with pure ice. "I dare you to walk up to Harrison Davenport, a man who has his own team of corporate investigators, and tell him that my federally audited patented software company is a scam. Please, Chloe, go do it. I would love to watch him laugh you out of the building." Chloe opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She knew she was cornered. Tyrone grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the hallway. He glared at me with a look of absolute hatred. You are going to regret this, Maya, he threatened. You think you are untouchable because of your money. We will see about that. I pushed the heavy door completely open and gestured toward the hallway. Find your way out, I said. Brenda let out a frustrated growl and stormed out, dragging Chloe behind her. Tyrone followed, slamming the heavy, sweet door so hard the walls vibrated. The sudden silence in my room was a welcome relief. I walked over to the minibar, poured myself another glass of water, and took a deep breath. They were scrambling, desperate, and dangerous, but they had absolutely no power over me anymore. I decided I needed a change of scenery to clear my head. I slipped my shoes back on, grabbed my room key, and took the elevator down to the hotel's private lounge. The bar was dimly lit and mostly empty, smelling of expensive bourbon and polished leather. I took a seat in a secluded booth near the back, ordering a simple cocktail. As the bartender set my drink down, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw an encrypted email notification from Marcus, the private investigator I had retained on retainer for the past 3 years. I originally hired Marcus to ensure my family never tried to attach themselves to my corporate entities, but a month ago I had asked him to dig slightly deeper into Tyrone and Brenda's financial history. Something about their sudden ability to afford country club memberships when I was a teenager had never sat right with me. I opened the secure PDF attachment. The document was 60 pages of forensic accounting, bank transfers, and property records. I skimmed through the executive summary, my eyes catching on specific dates and routing numbers. The air in my lungs turned to ice as the pieces finally snapped together. My biological mother had passed away when I was 10 years old. I was always told she died with nothing leaving me, with only a few boxes of photographs and her old nursing pins. But the documents on my screen told a violently different story. She had a life insurance policy and a secret trust fund set up exclusively in my name, intended to mature on my 18th birthday. The total value was exactly $250,000. I scrolled down to the bank records. 6 months before my 18th birthday, the exact same month Brenda kicked me out of the house, the trust fund had been completely drained. There were forged signatures, highly illegal beneficiary transfers, and direct routing numbers leading straight into Tyrone and Brenda's joint accounts. I traced the outflow of the stolen money. The forensic accountant had mapped every purchase. My mother's death benefit had paid for Chloe's European backpacking trip. It had paid for the down payment on the luxury SUV Chloe drove to high school. It had paid for Brenda's country club initiation fees. They had not just abandoned me. They had deliberately, methodically robbed me blind to fund the golden child's perfect life. I set my phone face down on the leather table. My hands were perfectly still. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the urge to scream. I felt a cold, calculated clarity wash over my entire body. Tomorrow was Chloe's wedding day, the day she was supposed to secure her future with the Davenport fortune. My family thought the worst thing I could do was refuse to write a check. They had no idea I was about to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. The heavy silence in my hotel suite stretched on for a fraction of a second before I finally broke it. I am not giving you a single dime, I stated clearly, my voice devoid of any anger or hesitation. It was a simple, absolute fact delivered with the same clinical detachment I used to decline unfavorable terms in the boardroom. Tyrone's face instantly darkened, the veins in his thick neck bulging against his starched collar. He took a heavy, aggressive step toward me. His sheer physical size meant to intimidate me, the way it had when I was a helpless teenager living under his roof. But I was no longer a frightened girl, and I did not shrink back. I held my ground, meeting his furious gaze with a cold, unyielding stare. "You listen to me!" Maya, Tyrone growled, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. "You are going to pull out your checkbook, and you are going to cover this overage. You have $85 million. 150,000 is pocket change to you. You owe this family." "I owe this family absolutely nothing," I countered, keeping my tone perfectly level. "You made a reckless financial commitment to impress a circle of billionaires, assuming you could manipulate Harrison Davenport into covering your excess. Your gamble failed. That is a basic consequence of poor risk management, Tyrone. It is not my responsibility to bail you out of a deficit you actively chose to create. Brenda pushed past Tyrone, her face tight with a frantic calculating energy. She realized immediately that physical intimidation was not going to work, so she pivoted effortlessly to her favorite weapon, emotional manipulation. She clasped her hands together in a gesture of pleading motherly concern, her eyes wide and wet. "Maya, please," Brenda implored, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "We are your family. We took you in. We put a roof over your head, fed you, clothed you. Family shares their blessings. You have been blessed with so much success, and we are so proud of you. But your sister is in crisis. Her perfect day is about to be ruined. How can you stand there and let your own flesh and blood suffer when you have the power to fix it with the stroke of a pen?" I stared at her, genuinely fascinated by her ability to weaponize the very history she had corrupted. "You did not take me in, Brenda," I replied, my words sharp and precise. "I was born into this family just like Chloe. The difference is that you treated her like an investment and me like a burden. As for the roof over my head, you revoked that the moment I turned 18 because I refused to surrender my dead mother's life insurance policy to fund your country club dues. You threw my belongings into 2 black trash bags and locked the deadbolt. Do not dare stand in my suite and invoke the sanctity of family. You forfeited that right a decade ago." Chloe, who had been vibrating with barely contained panic, suddenly snapped. The illusion of the sophisticated, wealthy bride vanished entirely, replaced by the petulant, spoiled child who had never been told no. "You are just jealous!" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings of the suite. Her face contorted into an ugly, blotchy mask of pure rage. "You have always been jealous of me, Maya. You sit in your corporate offices all day because you have no one to go home to. You are a bitter, lonely, pathetic workaholic, and you cannot stand the fact that I am about to marry into one of the most powerful families in the state." I did not interrupt her. I simply watched her spiral, letting her exhaust her own toxic energy. "You want to ruin my wedding because no one will ever love you," she continued, tears of absolute fury spilling over her heavily contoured cheeks. "You think your money makes you better than us. You think because Harrison Davenport shook your hand, you are untouchable, but you are not." "But you are." Chloe took a step forward, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. "If you do not write that check right now, I will destroy you. I will go straight to Julian and Harrison. I will tell them that your little software company is a complete scam. I will tell them you are a fraud, a liar, and a manipulator. I will tell them you stole your startup capital. I will ruin your reputation in this city before you even sign that contract with them. They will cancel the deal, Maya. I will make sure of it." For a moment, the room was dead silent. Tyrone and Brenda looked at Chloe, a flicker of triumphant hope passing between them. They actually believed she had found my weak spot. They genuinely thought the threat of corporate sabotage would force my hand. I looked at Chloe's tear-streaked, vindictive face, and then I laughed. It was not a defensive laugh, nor was it a forced chuckle to mask anxiety. It was a cold, genuine, echoing laugh that bubbled up from the sheer, staggering absurdity of her threat. I laughed because the depth of her ignorance was almost breathtaking. Chloe's triumphant smirk faltered. Her hand dropped slowly to her side. "What is so funny?" she demanded, her voice wavering. I shook my head, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. She instinctively recoiled, shrinking back until her shoulders hit the wall near the doorframe. I stopped just 2 feet away, towering over her, letting the absolute certainty of my power settle over her like a suffocating weight. "You want to tell Harrison Davenport that my business is a scam?" I asked, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper. "Please, Chloe, I strongly encourage you to do exactly that." I paused, letting my eyes bore into hers. Harrison Davenport runs a multi-billion-dollar healthcare conglomerate. Before his acquisition team even scheduled a preliminary Zoom call with me, his forensic auditors spent 3 months tearing through my company's financial history. They analyzed every patent, every line of code, and every federal tax return my agency has filed since its inception. Apex Medical Solutions is a federally audited, compliant, and highly transparent entity. I tilted my head, offering her a chilling, predatory smile. "So go ahead. Walk up to a man who employs armies of corporate lawyers and tell him that his entire due diligence team missed a scam that his future daughter-in-law magically uncovered. I would absolutely love to watch him laugh you out of the bridal suite. Do you know what he will actually think, Chloe? He will think you are a hysterical, financially illiterate liability, and he will wonder why his son is marrying a woman who fundamentally does not understand how the real world operates. Chloe opened her mouth to argue, her lips trembling, but no sound came out. The air had been completely sucked out of her lungs. The realization that she held absolutely no leverage, that her threats were hollow, childish tantrums against an impenetrable fortress, finally crashed down on her. She looked frantically toward her parents for help, but Tyrone was staring at the floor, his bluster entirely deflated. Brenda, however, refused to surrender gracefully. She grabbed the handle of the suite door, her face pale and twisted with pure venomous hatred. "You are a disgrace to the family name, Maya." Brenda spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and absolute defeat. "You have no heart. You have no soul. You are a cold, selfish machine, and you are going to die alone with your money." I leaned casually against the polished oak console table, entirely unfazed by her vitriol. "The family name means nothing to me, Brenda. I built my own name. Now I suggest you get out of my room and figure out how to explain a $150,000 deficit to your new in-laws. I hear Harrison is a stickler for fiscal responsibility." Brenda let out a frustrated, guttural sound of pure rage. She yanked the heavy suite door open and stormed out into the carpeted hallway. Chloe followed immediately, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with hysterical, defeated sobs. Tyrone lingered for a fraction of a second. He looked at me, his fists clenched at his sides as if debating whether to launch one final threat. But my gaze remained steady, bored, and completely unafraid. He had no power here. He was just a man drowning in a financial disaster of his own making. He turned on his heel and walked out, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The door clicked, and the automatic locking mechanism engaged. The sudden silence in the suite was absolute and incredibly peaceful. I walked over to the wet bar, poured myself a fresh glass of mineral water, and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering city skyline. They had come to break me, to drain me, and to assert their dominance. Instead, they had walked away with nothing but the crushing reality of their own incompetence. The argument was over. The threat was neutralized, and tomorrow their carefully constructed house of cards was going to collapse completely. The lingering toxicity of Tyrone and Brenda's desperation clung to the air of my hotel suite like a cheap, suffocating perfume. Even after the heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind them, the room still vibrated with the pathetic echo of Chloe's threats. I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my phone, slipped into my tailored blazer, and left the suite. I bypassed the bustling main lobby, where wedding guests were undoubtedly still gossiping about the rehearsal dinner fallout, and took the private elevator down to the hotel's exclusive basement lounge. The lounge was a sanctuary of dark leather-polished brass and quiet discretion. I chose a secluded corner booth, the kind designed for high-level corporate negotiations, and ordered a neat bourbon. As the bartender set the crystal glass on the table, I took a slow, steadying breath. My family had just attempted to extort me for $150,000 to fund a wedding they had used to publicly mock me. The sheer staggering delusion required to make that demand was almost fascinating. They actually believed they still held the power. They thought I was still the discarded teenager they could manipulate with guilt and intimidation. My phone vibrated against the black marble table, pulling me from my thoughts. The screen lit up with a single encrypted notification. It was not a text from a vendor or a panicked email from my executive assistant. It was a secure server alert from Marcus, a former federal forensic accountant I kept on permanent retainer for corporate intelligence. I had given Marcus a very specific, deeply personal assignment 2 months ago. While my corporate legal team was busy navigating Apex Medical Solutions merger contracts, Marcus was digging into the past, specifically the timeline of Tyrone's financial history. Long before I was kicked out of the house at 18, I had noticed glaring discrepancies in my family's lifestyle. When I was 16, Tyrone's modest salary as a regional sales manager had magically stretched to accommodate a brand new luxury SUV, a total renovation of their suburban home, and Chloe's sudden enrollment in an elite, heavily guarded private academy. Meanwhile, I was wearing secondhand clothes, working weekends to pay for my own school lunches, and being constantly reminded that my mere existence was a massive financial burden. I had always assumed Tyrone was simply drowning in predatory credit card debt to maintain his upper middle class facade. But as my own business acumen grew over the years, the math of my childhood never quite added up. I used my biometric key to unlock the file. A 120-page PDF labeled Washington_financial_audit_archive materialized on my screen. I bypassed the executive summary and dove straight into the raw data, my eyes tracking the highlighted routing numbers, property deeds, and offshore wire transfers. As I scrolled through the perfectly documented evidence, the missing puzzle pieces of my life clicked together with sickening, devastating precision. My biological mother had passed away when I was 10 years old. I always knew about her modest life insurance policy, the exact policy Tyrone had demanded I sign over to him on my 18th birthday, the refusal of which led to me being thrown out with 2 trash bags. But Marcus's audit revealed that the insurance policy was merely a convenient distraction. My mother had secretly inherited a substantial portfolio of commercial real estate from her estranged father shortly before she died. The properties were located in a rapidly developing sector of the city, and she had placed them in a sealed trust entirely in my name. According to the meticulously forged bank records and property deeds displayed on my screen, Tyrone had not just managed those properties. Less than 3 weeks after my mother's funeral, he had utilized a fraudulently obtained power of attorney to systematically liquidate the entire portfolio. He sold off prime commercial real estate for pennies on the dollar to shell LLCs he secretly controlled with Brenda. The total value of the stolen assets was staggering, over $2.8 million. The breath hitched in my throat not from sadness, but from the sheer scale of the betrayal. They hadn't just kicked me out because I was a rebellious teenager or because I refused to hand over a small insurance check. They kicked me out the exact week I legally became an adult because they were terrified I would gain access to my mother's estate files and demand an audit. They needed me homeless, desperate, and struggling to survive, so I would never have the resources, the money, or the mental bandwidth to hire a lawyer and look into their past. My entire childhood of deprivation was not due to a lack of funds. It was a calculated, malicious strategy to keep me submissive while they lived lavishly on the inheritance my mother had secured for me. Chloe's designer handbags, her private university tuition, the luxury cars, the very foundation of her arrogant entitlement, all of it was paid for with my stolen legacy. And less than an hour ago, Tyrone had stood in my suite, puffing out his chest, demanding I write him a check for a wedding that was already funded by my stolen money. He had looked me in the eye and claimed he had given me the foundation for my success, completely blind to the fact that his own financial house was built on a foundation of theft. I set my phone down next to my bourbon. The ice in my glass cracked in the quiet room. I didn't feel the urge to cry. I didn't feel the familiar heavy ache of a daughter seeking validation. What washed over me was a wave of absolute freezing clarity. Tyrone and Brenda were not just negligent, emotionally abusive parents. They were felons. They had committed grand larceny, wire fraud, and tax evasion. I took a sip of my drink, the cool liquid matching the ice in my veins. The rehearsal dinner takedown had been a mere corporate flex, a simple realignment of power. Tomorrow was Chloe's wedding day. Harrison Davenport had already pulled his financial backing, but Tyrone and Brenda were desperate enough to try and salvage the event. They would inevitably spin some elaborate lie, point the finger at me, and try to keep the Davenports from walking away completely. They thought the absolute worst thing that could happen to them was a canceled wedding and a vendor bill they couldn't pay. They had absolutely no idea that I was holding the exact paperwork required to send them to federal prison. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone until my vision blurred the blue light reflecting in the dark amber of my bourbon. The initial shock of the property liquidation had momentarily blinded me to the intricate secondary details of Marcus's report. I took another sip of my drink, the alcohol burning a clean path down my throat, and zoomed in on the next section of the dossier. The forensic accounting was broken down year by year, month by month, and finally transaction by transaction. Marcus had meticulously mapped the exact flow of a secondary, highly liquid asset. It was the $250,000 trust fund my mother had set up purely in cash. This was the safety net, the untouchable emergency reserve intended to guarantee my college tuition and living expenses in the event of her passing. I tracked the outflow of those funds. It was a masterclass in financial parasitism. Tyrone and Brenda had not just stolen the money, they had flaunted it directly in my face for years, daring me to question their sudden affluence while constantly reminding me of what a burden I was to feed and clothe. The dates aligned perfectly. I scrolled to August of my sophomore year of high school. I remembered that month vividly. My shoes had holes in the soles, and Brenda had shrieked at me for asking for $30 to buy a new pair, calling me a selfish, ungrateful brat who did not understand the value of a hard-earned dollar. 3 days later, according to the bank records glowing on my screen, Brenda had authorized a wire transfer of $12,000 from my mother's trust. The memo line read, Chloe Academy tuition. Every single luxury that had defined Chloe's golden childhood was stamped with my mother's name. The brand new Mercedes SUV, sitting in the driveway on Chloe's 16th birthday, was funded by a $45,000 withdrawal from the trust. The designer bags she paraded through the hallways, the European backpacking trip she took after graduation, the imported silk dresses she wore to country club mixers, they were all paid for with the money meant to secure my future. They had quite literally worn my inheritance. But as I scrolled further down into the more recent financial disclosures, a new, even more pathetic reality emerged. Marcus had managed to pull Tyrone and Brenda's current credit reports and active account balances. They were completely, unequivocally broke. The hundreds of thousands they had stolen from the trust fund were gone, evaporated, squandered on a lifestyle they had no idea how to sustain. They had lived like billionaires for a decade, burning through capital with zero investments and zero foresight. Now their primary checking account held less than $4,000. Their house was leveraged with 3 separate mortgages. They had maxed out 7 different high-yield credit cards. They were drowning in predatory debt, frantically paddling to keep their heads above water long enough to secure Chloe's marriage to Julian Davenport. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The Davenports were not just a social upgrade for my family, they were a financial rescue mission. Tyrone and Brenda were counting on Harrison Davenport's bottomless wealth to bail them out of their imminent bankruptcy. Chloe's entire relationship was a calculated extraction strategy to replace the funds they had already bled dry from my mother's estate. I scrolled to the final page of the PDF, which detailed the transactions from the last 3 months. My eyes locked onto a wire transfer of $50,000 paid directly to the historic botanical estate where Chloe's wedding was supposed to take place tomorrow. It was the deposit, the non-refundable massive deposit required to secure the venue and maintain the illusion of generational wealth in front of Harrison Davenport. And the source of that $50,000 was the absolute last, scraping the bottom of the barrel withdrawal from the very last shell account holding my mother's money. They had drained my trust down to the final cent to pay for the stage where they planned to humiliate me. That was why Tyrone had been so frantic, so aggressively desperate in my hotel suite just an hour ago. The wedding was $150,000 over budget, and Harrison, sensing something off, had pulled his funding to teach them a lesson. Tyrone did not have the money. Brenda did not have the money. The stolen well had run completely dry. When they ambushed my room demanding a check, weaponizing guilt and telling me I owed them for putting a roof over my head, they were not just being greedy. They were cornered rats. If the florists walked out, if the lighting crews packed up, the Davenports would realize the Washington family was a destitute fraud. The marriage would collapse, and Tyrone and Brenda would be exposed to their creditors. I sat back against the tufted leather booth, staring blankly at the dim lighting of the hotel bar. It is a strange, hollow feeling to realize that the people who were supposed to protect you, viewed you as nothing more than a bank account to be plundered. For years, I had internalized their disdain. I had genuinely believed I was difficult to love, that my ambition was an abrasive flaw, that my independence was a rejection of their generosity. But there was no generosity. There was only theft. I took the final sip of my bourbon. The alcohol tasted like ash, but my mind was sharper than a scalpel. I did not feel rage anymore. Rage is a hot, uncontrolled emotion. What I felt was absolute freezing execution. They had stolen my past, but I was going to dictate their future. I paid my tab, leaving a generous cash tip on the table, and took the private elevator back up to my penthouse suite. The silence of the room was welcoming. I walked over to my briefcase, pulled out my encrypted laptop, and connected to the portable printer I always traveled with. I spent the next 3 hours preparing the execution. I printed every page of Marcus's forensic audit. I highlighted the forged signatures on the power of attorney documents. I pulled the exact bank routing numbers that showed the transfer of my mother's death benefits directly into Tyrone's personal checking account. I printed the itemized list of Chloe's private school tuition payments and matched them with the exact dates the trust was drained. I compiled the evidence of their current financial ruin, highlighting the maxed-out credit cards, the multiple mortgages, and the predatory loans. I organized the documents meticulously into sleek black presentation folders. It was the exact same format I used when presenting a hostile corporate takeover to a board of directors. Because that is exactly what this was. My family thought the worst thing I could do was refuse to write a check to cover the floral arrangements. They thought Chloe's childish threat to slander my business to Harrison Davenport was a winning hand. They were playing a game of checkers, unaware that I owned the entire board. I checked my watch. It was 4 in the morning. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was still wrapped in darkness, but the first faint hints of dawn were beginning to bleed over the horizon. Today was Chloe's wedding day, the day she was supposed to walk down the aisle in a custom couture gown paid for with my mother's blood money. The day Tyrone and Brenda were supposed to finally secure their proximity to billionaire status. I closed the last black folder, the thick cardstock snapping shut with a satisfying finality. I walked into the marble bathroom, turned on the shower, and let the scalding water wash away the last lingering traces of the terrified, discarded teenager I used to be. When I stepped out, I dressed with absolute precision. I bypassed the pastel wedding guest attire I had originally packed and chose a razor-sharp tailored ivory suit. I pulled my hair back into a severe, polished style. I was not dressing for a family celebration. I was dressing for a corporate assassination. I slipped the black folders into my leather briefcase and grabbed my phone. I sent a quick single-line text to Marcus, instructing him to forward the entire audit to the federal authorities on Monday morning. Then I walked out of my suite and headed toward the waiting car. It was time to attend a wedding. The morning sun was brutally bright as my town car pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the historic botanical estate. The sprawling grounds were already swarming with florists, catering crews, and event planners rushing to finalize the extravagant details of Chloe's perfectly curated illusion. I stepped out of the vehicle, the crisp ivory fabric of my tailored suit standing in stark contrast to the chaotic sea of pastel bridesmaids and frantic coordinators. I did not look like a woman attending a family celebration. I looked like a woman arriving for a hostile corporate takeover. My hand gripped the handle of my black leather briefcase, the weight of the financial dossiers inside grounding me. I bypassed the main bridal suite, entirely ignoring the confused glances of a few extended relatives who had arrived early. I headed straight for the estate's glass-enclosed conservatory, where a private breakfast was scheduled for the immediate families. I expected tense glares. I expected whispered insults from Brenda. What I did not expect was Julian intercepting me in the main hallway before I even reached the double doors. Julian grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly tight, his face pale and etched with panic. I looked down at his hand resting on my ivory sleeve, my expression so glacial that he immediately released me and took a step back. "Maya, we need to talk right now," Julian demanded, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. He looked over his shoulder as if expecting federal agents to storm the hallway. My father is absolutely furious. We are moments away from canceling this entire event. I smoothed the fabric of my sleeve, completely unbothered by his dramatic urgency. Cancel the event, Julian? That sounds like a highly rational decision given the circumstances. Do not play games with me, Julian snapped, his polished country club demeanor cracking. Chloe told us everything this morning. She broke down at breakfast. She confessed that she could not marry into our family with a clear conscience, knowing the massive liability you bring to our corporate merger. She told us about the malpractice. I paused. For a fraction of a second, I genuinely tried to process the sheer absurdity of his words. Malpractice. Yes. Julian continued, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. She told us about your previous nursing job, how you were quietly terminated for severe medical malpractice that resulted in patient harm. She said you manipulated clinical data to cover it up, and that Apex Medical Solutions is currently under active investigation by the FDA and the SEC. My father is demanding a private meeting with you immediately. He is ready to terminate the acquisition deal. Our hospital network cannot absorb that kind of catastrophic liability. I stared at him. Chloe had actually done it. She had doubled down on her threat from the hotel suite, but instead of just calling my company a scam, she had fabricated a wildly detailed, incredibly damaging lie designed to hit Harrison Davenport right in his corporate risk assessment. She was banking on the fact that the sudden threat of federal investigations and medical malpractice would cause Harrison to panic, drop the merger, and excommunicate me before the truth could be verified. Take me to him, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Julian led me down the corridor and pushed open the heavy oak doors to the estate's private library. The room was tense and suffocating. Harrison Davenport stood behind a massive mahogany desk, his face a mask of furious, contained thunder. Brenda and Tyrone stood awkwardly near the bookshelves, looking simultaneously terrified and desperately hopeful. And there, sitting in a plush leather wingback chair, was Chloe. She was already wearing her silk bridal robe, clutching a tissue, her eyes perfectly rimmed with calculated waterproof tears. Maya, Harrison began, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. His tone held none of the warm paternal respect he usually reserved for me during our board meetings. I will get straight to the point. We are halting all progress on the Apex acquisition. Chloe came to us this morning out of concern for our family's reputation and our hospital network's liability. I am so sorry, Maya, Chloe cried, dabbing her dry eyes with the tissue. She looked at Julian for support, and he immediately moved to stand behind her chair, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. I just could not let Julian and Harrison walk into a federal trap. I know you threatened to ruin my wedding if I told them about your clinical negligence, but I had to protect them. They are my family now. I did not immediately respond. I walked slowly to the center of the room, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I looked at Tyrone and Brenda. They were holding their breath, praying that Chloe's desperate, slanderous gamble would somehow neutralize me and save their access to the Davenport wealth. I turned my attention back to the billionaire CEO standing behind the desk. Harrison. I began, keeping my tone entirely conversational, devoid of any defensiveness. I have a tremendous amount of respect for your business acumen. You built a healthcare empire from a single regional clinic. You employ a small army of the most ruthless forensic auditors, compliance officers, and corporate attorneys on the Eastern Seaboard. Harrison narrowed his eyes, his posture rigid. Your point, Maya. My point, Harrison, is that before you offered me a multi-million-dollar acquisition contract, your team spent 90 days colonoscoping my entire life. They audited every line of code my engineers wrote, every tax return I ever filed, and every background check available. I tilted my head, looking directly into his eyes. So I want you to ask yourself a very simple, logical question. How is it possible that your elite team of corporate investigators completely missed a federal SEC probe, an FDA investigation, and a terminated clinical license, yet your future daughter-in-law managed to uncover this massive conspiracy just hours before she is supposed to walk down the aisle? Harrison frowned, the absolute logic of my statement immediately piercing through his initial panic. He looked at Chloe, a flicker of hard analytical doubt passing over his features. Chloe realized she was losing ground and immediately escalated her performance. "She is lying, Julian." Chloe sobbed, reaching back to grab his hand. "She is a manipulator. She paid people off to steal her records. She was a floor nurse at Mercy General and she almost killed someone." I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a cold sound that cut through the heavy air of the library. "A floor nurse," I repeated, shaking my head in pure amusement. "Chloe, my undergraduate degree is in biomedical engineering. My master's is in healthcare data analytics. I have never held a nursing license in my entire life, nor have I ever been employed in a clinical care capacity. You cannot be terminated for medical malpractice when you are legally not a medical practitioner." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the polished mahogany desk toward Harrison. "This is my active credentialing file from the State Board, Harrison. You can verify it with a single phone call to your own compliance director. Furthermore, a federal investigation by the SEC would require a public filing, which does not exist because my company is entirely privately funded and debt-free." The room fell dead silent. Julian looked down at Chloe, his hand slowly sliding off her shoulder. The protective stance he had taken just moments before dissolved into stark, dawning realization. Chloe's face flushed a deep, ugly red. Her mouth opened and closed, but she had backed herself into a corner composed of easily disprovable facts. She had vastly underestimated the intelligence of the men she was trying to manipulate. Harrison picked up the document, scanned it for 3 seconds, and then looked at Chloe. The fury that had previously been directed at me shifted entirely to the bride. "You fabricated a story involving federal investigations and medical malpractice," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. "You attempted to interfere with a $50 million corporate acquisition because of a petty family dispute." "It is not a dispute," Tyrone suddenly blurted out, stepping forward in a frantic attempt to save the sinking ship. "Harrison, please, my daughter is just under a lot of stress. Maya has been incredibly cruel to her. Maya threatened to ruin the wedding if we did not pay her money." I smiled. It was the exact opening I needed. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick black presentation folders I had assembled at 4 in the morning. "Actually, Tyrone," I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority, "Chloe was half right about one thing. There is a massive fraud hovering over this wedding, and there are federal crimes involved. She simply confused the perpetrators." I placed the first black folder directly in front of Harrison Davenport. "I suggest you open that, Harrison. Because if you want to talk about catastrophic liability, you need to look at the people you are actually merging families with. Julian, you might want to look at this as well. It contains the complete financial history of Tyrone and Brenda Washington." Chloe let out a strangled gasp, and Brenda grabbed the edge of the bookshelf as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath her. I looked at my parents, my expression completely devoid of mercy. "You see, Harrison, the deposit for this beautiful estate, the custom dress Chloe is wearing, the entire illusion of their wealth, it was all funded by a stolen $250,000 trust fund and the illegal liquidation of my dead mother's commercial real estate portfolio. And I have the forged power of attorney documents right here to prove it." Harrison stared at the black folder resting on his mahogany desk. He did not open it immediately. Instead, his sharp, calculating eyes moved from the thick cardstock to Tyrone's sweating face, then to Brenda's trembling hands, and finally to Chloe, who was shrinking into the leather wingback chair. "Get out," Harrison ordered, his voice dangerously low. Tyrone tried to speak, to offer some pathetic justification, but Harrison raised a single hand, silencing him instantly. "All of you, out of my library. Julian, deal with your bride," Harrison commanded. The room cleared rapidly, leaving only the heavy silence of an averted crisis. Harrison picked up the folder, but he gestured toward a set of frosted glass doors at the back of the room. "My private boardroom," he instructed. "We need to have a very clear conversation." We entered a sterile, soundproof space dominated by a long glass conference table and state-of-the-art presentation technology. Harrison tossed the black folder onto the surface. He remained standing, leaning over the table, his posture radiating corporate aggression. He was treating me like a hostile vendor, trying to assert dominance through sheer physical presence. Domestic theft and forged power of attorney documents are a matter for the authorities. Maya Harrison began, his tone clipped. They explain why your family is desperate, but they do not solve my immediate problem. Chloe made specific, actionable claims about your professional conduct. You showed me a single state board document out there. I need more. I will not expose Davenport Healthcare to a federal audit by acquiring a company tainted by malpractice or SEC violations. I need absolute proof right now, or our deal is dead. I did not flinch. I did not act defensive, nor did I show a single ounce of emotional distress at being accused of federal crimes by my own sister. That was exactly what Chloe had counted on, a hysterical, emotional reaction that would make me look guilty. Instead, I calmly unlatched my leather briefcase and pulled out my laptop. I appreciate your diligence, Harrison, I replied smoothly, booting up the machine. In your position, I would demand the exact same thing. I bypassed the room's wireless network, connecting my laptop directly to the large presentation monitor on the wall via a secure hardwired cable. I unlocked my encrypted drive with a biometric scan and opened the master compliance vault for Apex Medical Solutions. I did not waste time with frantic reassurances. I let the raw, undisputed data speak for itself. Let us begin with the claim of medical malpractice, I stated, pulling up a series of official state and federal databases. While I am a biomedical engineer by trade, my early career required maintaining a specialized clinical nursing license to oversee direct patient data trials. I pulled up the state board registry and projected it onto the massive screen. Here is my spotless nursing license, renewed and in perfect standing. 0 infractions, 0 disciplinary actions, 0 patient complaints in the history of my career. I clicked to the next encrypted file, bringing up a wall of highly complex financial charts and federal seals. Now, regarding the federal investigations, I continued, my voice echoing with clinical precision. Here are the unredacted certified results of our most recent voluntary audits conducted by both the FDA and the SEC. These were completed just 4 weeks ago in preparation for our market expansion. As you can clearly see, we received a flawless compliance rating across all departments. Apex Medical Solutions operates with absolute impenetrable transparency. Harrison scrutinized the documents displayed on the screen. He was a man who lived and breathed corporate risk, and he knew an airtight compliance record when he saw one. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes scanning the federal signatures and audit scores. I watched the tension slowly leave his shoulders. He let out a long, measured exhale and pulled out a leather chair, finally taking a seat at the table. "Your sister is a dangerous liability," Harrison muttered, rubbing his temples. "To fabricate a story of that magnitude on the morning of her wedding. Julian is going to have to seriously reconsider this marriage. But as far as our business is concerned, I am satisfied. The acquisition can proceed under the previously agreed-upon terms." I remained standing. I looked down at the billionaire who thought he was doing me a favor by graciously keeping his word. I reached over and tapped a key on my laptop, closing the compliance files. "I am glad you are satisfied with my company's integrity, Harrison," I said, my voice dropping to a cool, lethal register. "However, the previously agreed-upon terms are no longer acceptable to me." Harrison's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing in genuine confusion. "Excuse me. You are in my house dealing with the fallout of your family's fraudulent extortion attempt, and you are trying to renegotiate our merger." "I am not renegotiating the merger, Harrison. I am canceling it." Before he could erupt into corporate outrage, I opened a new, highly restricted folder on my desktop. The massive wall monitor illuminated with a series of advanced legal drafts, letters of intent, and private equity term sheets. I watched his eyes scan the bold black headers across the top of the documents, waiting for the exact moment the realization hit him. It took less than 5 seconds. The color completely drained from Harrison Davenport's face. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open, his impenetrable corporate armor completely shattered. You are looking at the final acquisition drafts between Apex Medical Solutions and Vanguard Health Partners, I explained, letting the name of his absolute biggest, most aggressive regional competitor ring through the boardroom. For the past 6 months, while your team was conducting due diligence to acquire my software, I was using that same software to map the systemic inefficiencies in the regional healthcare market. Vanguard realized that integrating my AI models would give them a 40% operational advantage over your network. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the cool glass table, forcing him to meet my gaze. I do not need Davenport Healthcare to validate my success, Harrison. I have secured enough private equity backing to acquire a controlling stake in Vanguard. We are closing the deal on Monday. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Harrison was paralyzed. He had spent the last 20 minutes acting as the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner, deciding whether my company was worthy of his empire. He had completely failed to realize that I had outmaneuvered him on a scale he could barely comprehend. If Vanguard integrated my technology, they would render Davenport Healthcare obsolete within 3 fiscal quarters. You used our acquisition talks as leverage, Harrison finally said, his voice hoarse, entirely devoid of its previous arrogance. I used my data to find the most profitable path forward, I corrected him smoothly. Your son chose to align your family with a woman who is not only a pathological liar, but the daughter of 2 felons who stole my inheritance to fund their pathetic charade. You brought that liability into your home, Harrison. I am simply removing my assets from the blast radius. I closed my laptop and slid it back into my briefcase. The crisp click of the brass locks echoed loudly in the quiet room. What do you want, Maya? Harrison asked. It was no longer a demand. It was a surrender. The ruthless patriarch of the Davenport family was asking for terms. I want nothing from you, I replied, picking up my briefcase. I am leaving this estate. Whether Julian marries Chloe is your problem. Whether you choose to fund a wedding built on stolen money is your problem. But understand this clearly. The Washington family has zero connection to me, my wealth, or my company. If Tyrone, Brenda, or Chloe ever attempt to invoke my name, contact my offices, or interfere with my business again, I will not just send those forensic folders to the federal authorities. I will ensure Vanguard actively targets and dismantles your hospital network. I turned and walked toward the frosted glass doors. I did not wait for his response. I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped back into the library, leaving the billionaire staring blankly at his empty glass table, entirely and comprehensively outplayed. I had my hand resting on the brushed steel handle of the frosted glass door when Harrison spoke. It was not a command this time. It was a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. I paused, turning my head just enough to see him staring past me, his gaze locked onto the massive presentation monitor mounted on the boardroom wall. I had closed the Vanguard acquisition files, but I had intentionally delayed severing the HDMI connection from my laptop. The screen was now mirroring my active browser, displaying a split-screen view of the County Public Records database and the Federal Bankruptcy Court portal. Tyrone and Brenda Washington's names were splashed across the monitor, in stark, undeniable high definition. Beside their names were rows of red text indicating severe financial distress. Notice of default. Asset liens. Chapter 11. Pre-filing status. What exactly am I looking at right now? Harrison asked, his voice dangerously quiet. He walked slowly around the glass table, his eyes never leaving the projection. I feigned a brief moment of professional embarrassment, reaching for the connection cable. My apologies, Harrison. I meant to close that tab. It is a secondary file from my corporate investigator. Leave it, he commanded, placing a heavy hand on the edge of my laptop. Explain this to me, right now. I let go of the cable, taking a step back and folding my arms. I allowed the cold, clinical reality of the situation to wash over the room. You are looking at the actual financial foundation of your future in-laws, I stated, my tone devoid of any emotion. You pride yourself on due diligence, Harrison. You investigate corporate mergers with a fine-tooth comb. But it seems your family failed to run a basic credit check on the people standing at your altar. Harrison's jaw tightened. They presented themselves as successful real estate developers, Tyrone mentioned a lucrative commercial portfolio. That portfolio belonged to my late mother, I corrected smoothly, and Tyrone liquidated it illegally a decade ago. He burned through nearly $3 million trying to buy his way into circles like yours. He has zero actual revenue streams. What you are seeing on that screen is the absolute end of the road. I walked back to the laptop and tapped the trackpad, enlarging the county property records. Their primary residence in the suburbs is heavily leveraged. They have taken out 3 separate mortgages against the property, pulling out every cent of equity to maintain the illusion of wealth. The final notice of default was issued last Tuesday. The bank will initiate foreclosure proceedings within 14 days. Harrison stared at the dates, his sharp corporate mind instantly crunching the numbers. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly snapping together in his head. I clicked to the next tab, displaying a list of unsecured debts. They have 7 maxed-out high-yield credit cards. They owe over $40,000 in back taxes. Their luxury SUVs are on predatory leases that are currently 3 months in arrears. Their primary checking account holds less than $4,000. They are not merely struggling, Harrison. They are completely, irrecoverably insolvent. The billionaire took a slow, deep breath, the magnitude of the deception settling over him. He was a man who crushed rivals for sport, and he had just realized he was being played by amateurs right inside his own home. The wedding, Harrison muttered, his eyes tracing the red lines of debt on the monitor. Exactly, I said, leaning in to drive the final nail into the coffin. The wedding. Chloe's entire relationship with Julian is not a romantic union. It is a targeted financial extraction. Your family is the bailout. I brought up the final document on the screen. It was the wire transfer Marcus had flagged earlier. This is the deposit for the botanical estate where we are standing right now. $50,000. It was wired from a shell account yesterday morning. It drained the absolute last reserves of my mother's stolen money. I watched Harrison process the information as his face flushed with mounting rage. They demanded $150,000 from me in my hotel suite last night. I continued, letting the truth hang heavily in the air. They claimed it was to cover an overage that you refused to pay. But that was a lie. They needed that cash to keep their creditors at bay, just long enough for Chloe to sign the marriage certificate. They were terrified that if the vendors walked out today, you would realize they were broke and cancel the wedding. Harrison's hands gripped the edge of the glass table. The veins in his forearms bulged against his tailored cuffs. The realization that his son, the heir to the Davenport empire, was being used as a human ATM by a family of desperate grifters ignited a terrifying fury behind his eyes. She lied about your medical credentials, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, lethal whisper. She fabricated a federal investigation to destroy your credibility. Because I am the only person who knows the truth about their finances, I replied evenly. Chloe knew that if I spoke to you, their entire house of cards would collapse. Her lie this morning was a preemptive strike. She needed you to view me as a toxic liability so you would banish me from the estate before I could expose them as frauds. It was a desperate amateur move by a family entirely out of options. Harrison stepped back from the table, his posture straightening as the ruthless corporate titan took full control. The vulnerability and confusion were gone, replaced by a cold, calculating urge to destroy the threat to his family. They thought they could infiltrate my family, Harrison stated, his tone devoid of any warmth. They looked me in the eye, drank my wine, and tried to secure a permanent pipeline to my wealth while drowning in their own incompetence. They are grifters, Harrison. Nothing more, I said, reaching over and finally pulling the connection cable from my laptop. The massive monitor went black, leaving only our reflections on the dark glass screen. And Julian is their ultimate mark. Harrison did not argue. He did not ask for further proof. The evidence was irrefutable, and the sheer audacity of the con was enough to trigger his most destructive instincts. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing a number with rapid, angry strikes of his thumb. "Get my security director to the library immediately," Harrison barked into the phone. "And find Julian. Tell him to meet me in the main corridor. We have a severe security breach." He ended the call and looked at me. The dynamic between us had shifted entirely. There was no longer any condescension or suspicion. There was only the silent, grim acknowledgement between two people who understood how to neutralize a threat. "You have my apologies, Maya." Harrison said, his words crisp and formal. "Your family will be removed from this property within the hour. There will be no wedding today. And if they attempt to contact Julian again, my legal team will ensure they spend the rest of their pathetic lives buried in litigation. Make sure you include the forensic audit in your legal strategy," I advised, snapping my briefcase shut. Federal wire fraud carries a much heavier penalty than a broken engagement. I walked past the billionaire and pushed open the frosted glass doors. As I stepped back into the grand hallway of the estate, the chaotic sounds of wedding preparations were still echoing through the building. Florists were arranging towering displays of white orchids and caterers were bustling past with silver trays. It was a beautiful, expensive symphony of a celebration that was already dead. The con was over, the grifters were exposed, and my revenge was absolute. I did not immediately summon my driver. The satisfaction of a perfectly executed corporate assassination requires a moment of quiet, deliberate reflection. I took a seat in the velvet-lined alcove adjacent to the library, signaling a passing catering waiter for a glass of sparkling water. I crossed my legs, smoothing the crease of my ivory suit, and waited. Through the partially open mahogany doors, the pristine acoustics of the estate amplified every word of the impending wreckage. Harrison did not waste a single second. I heard the sharp, heavy thud of the black presentation folder hitting a wooden surface. He outlined the situation to his son with the detached clinical precision of a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb. He read off the mortgage defaults, the maxed-out high-yield credit cards, the fraudulent wire transfers, and the stolen inheritance. He painted a terrifyingly accurate picture of the Washington family's absolute financial destitution. Julian's voice cracked. He argued, at first, his tone laced with desperate denial. He had spent the last 2 years vacationing with Chloe in what he thought were her family's private villas, driving imported cars he assumed they owned outright. He had bought into the carefully curated illusion of generational wealth. Harrison shattered each illusion with brutal efficiency. "They leased the cars," Julian Harrison barked, his voice vibrating with disgust. "They rented the villas on credit. They do not own a single commercial property. They are parasites, and they have attached themselves to our bank accounts to save themselves from drowning." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I could practically hear the gears turning in Julian's head, as the aristocratic, easygoing groom realized he was the mark in a decade-long grift. Harrison then presented the solution. He was a man who never brought up a crisis without an immediate mitigation strategy. A standard prenuptial agreement had been discussed months ago, but Chloe had skillfully manipulated Julian into watering it down. She had played the wounded romantic, shedding crocodile tears, and claiming a strict contract felt like a lack of trust in their sacred bond. Julian, blinded by infatuation, had caved. Harrison wasn't having it anymore. Within 20 minutes, a revised, ruthlessly binding legal contract was transmitted by Davenport Healthcare's legal team, printed in the estate's business center, and handed directly to Julian. It offered 0 spousal support, 0 equity in Davenport assets, and contained an immediate annulment clause triggered by any prior financial fraud or undisclosed debts. I watched Julian storm out of the library. The charming, oblivious air was gone. In his place was a man whose pride had been deeply wounded. His face was flushed dark red, his jaw tight, and the freshly printed legal document was gripped so fiercely in his fist that his knuckles were stark white. He did not even notice me sitting in the alcove as he marched past. I stood up, leaving my glass of sparkling water on a silver tray, and followed him up the grand, sweeping staircase. I had orchestrated this execution. I had absolutely no intention of missing the finale. Julian did not bother to knock. He shoved open the heavy double doors to the bridal suite with enough force that they bounced off the wall stops. I remained in the shadowed hallway, observing perfectly through the gap. The suite was a chaotic, fragrant cloud of hairspray, imported champagne, and frantic energy. Chloe sat at the center of the room in a custom silk robe, practicing her innocent, glowing bride smile in the vanity mirror. Brenda and Tyrone were hovering nearby, sipping mimosas and desperately trying to maintain their illusion of control. Julian dismissed the hair and makeup team with a single sharp command. The terrified stylist scrambled out of the room, leaving only the Washington family and the furious groom. Julian marched across the plush carpet and slammed the 30-page legal document onto the glass vanity right on top of Chloe's scattered expensive cosmetics. "Sign it," Julian demanded. His voice was entirely devoid of the adoration he usually showered upon her. Chloe blinked, her practiced, radiant smile faltering into a mask of genuine confusion. "Julian, what is this? We already discussed the prenup months ago. We agreed it wasn't necessary to be so aggressive. We are partners. That was before I knew your parents were 3 days away from foreclosure." Julian shot back, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "That was before I knew the deposit for this venue and the dress you are wearing were paid for with your sister's stolen inheritance." Brenda let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp, her champagne flute slipping from her hand and shattering against the floor. Tyrone stepped forward, attempting to puff out his chest and project a paternal authority he did not possess. "Now see here, Julian," Tyrone stammered, holding up his hands. "You cannot speak to my daughter this way on her wedding day. We are merging families. There are bound to be misunderstandings. Business has been slow, yes, but we are perfectly capable." "There is no misunderstanding," Tyrone Julian interrupted, slicing through the lie. "You owe $40,000 in back taxes. Your primary checking account holds less than $4,000. You spent the last decade playing billionaire with stolen funds, and you fully expected my father to absorb your catastrophic debts without noticing. You used me." Julian turned his burning gaze back to his bride. "You lied to me, Chloe. You lied about your background, your wealth, and your sister. You spun a psychotic story this morning about Maya facing federal charges just to get her out of the building before she could expose you." Chloe immediately deployed her ultimate weapon. The tears flowed instantly. She stood up, reaching for his hands, looking up at him with wide, devastated eyes. "Julian, please, I was terrified. I only lied because I was scared of Maya. She is so cruel to us. And yes, my parents had some financial setbacks, but I was so ashamed. I didn't want you to think less of me. You have to believe me, Julian. I love you for you, not for your money." It was a performance worthy of an award, but the audience had fundamentally changed. Julian stared down at her, his expression completely unmoved by the theatrical sobbing. The illusion had been shattered, and he was finally seeing the calculated reality beneath her tears. "If you love me for me and not for the Davenport fortune, then this document shouldn't be a problem," Julian said coldly. He tapped the thick stack of paper on the vanity. "This is an ironclad prenuptial agreement. It guarantees that in the event of a divorce, you walk away with exactly what you brought into this marriage. Nothing. Zero spousal support. Zero access to my trust. Zero payout." Brenda let out a wail, realizing that their entire financial rescue mission was evaporating before her eyes. If Chloe signed that document, the Washingtons would get absolutely nothing. They would be thrown to their creditors the moment the reception ended. Julian pulled a silver fountain pen from his tailored jacket pocket and dropped it onto the glass table, the metal clinking sharply next to the contract. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the suffocating silence of the room. "The ceremony is in 2 hours," Julian said, his eyes locked onto Chloe's terrified face. "You have exactly 5 minutes to sign that contract, Chloe. Prove to me this isn't a shakedown. Sign it right now, or I walk downstairs, cancel the catering, and tell the guests to go home." I sat in the quiet sanctuary of the estate's guest suite, the heavy mahogany door shut against the mounting chaos of the first floor. It was exactly 2 in the afternoon. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 2 hours, but the atmosphere permeating the historic grounds had shifted from celebratory anticipation to the frantic, muffled panic of a sinking ship. I poured myself a glass of iced water from the crystal pitcher on the sideboard, savoring the profound silence. That silence was violently shattered a fraction of a second later. The heavy door did not just open. It was thrown back with such force that the brass handle dented the floral wallpaper. Brenda and Tyrone burst into the room. The polished, aristocratic facade they had spent the entire morning cultivating was entirely gone. Brenda's meticulously styled hair was fraying at the edges, and her expensive pastel mother-of-the-bride dress looked rumpled. Tyrone's face was slick with a sheen of cold sweat, his breathing heavy and erratic. They looked exactly like what they were, two cornered, desperate frauds whose time had officially run out. "You ruined her!" Brenda screamed, her voice shrill and unhinged as she marched toward me. Her hands were curled into tight, trembling fists. She signed it. Chloe signed that disgusting contract. Julian stood there and threatened to cancel the entire wedding and humiliate us in front of 300 guests if she did not sign away every single right to his family's money. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, my expression remaining completely neutral. I failed to see how Chloe voluntarily signing a prenuptial agreement is my responsibility, Brenda. She is marrying for love, is she not? That is what she claimed downstairs. "Do not play smart with me!" Brenda shrieked, her face contorting with a visceral, ugly rage. "You did this. You went into that boardroom and poisoned Harrison against us. You showed him those files because you are a bitter, jealous, ugly dropout who cannot stand to see someone else succeed. You have always hated Chloe. You hated that she was beautiful, that she was loved, that she was getting the life you could never have. So you had to destroy it." I placed my glass down on the sideboard, the ice clinking sharply against the crystal. The insult hung in the air, pathetic and hollow. Dropout. It was her favorite weapon against me, a rusty blade she had been swinging for almost a decade. When I was 20, I realized the clinical nursing program my parents were forcing me into was nothing but a pipeline for them to secure a high-earning caregiver for their early retirement. When I dropped out to teach myself data analytics and build my first software algorithm, Brenda had thrown my belongings onto the front lawn. She had stood on the porch calling me a delusional, ugly failure who would end up destitute. She had taken the remainder of my college tuition fund and bought Chloe a European vacation to reward her for staying in her useless, overpriced art history program. "You are still calling me a dropout," I said, my voice dangerously calm, devoid of any shouting. "Brenda, I dropped out of a program I hated to build a healthcare technology firm that is currently finalizing a 9-figure acquisition. I am a self-made CEO. Your golden child stayed in school to learn how to spend money she did not have, and now she is legally bound to a marriage where she is worth absolutely nothing. Do not project your profound parenting failures onto me." Brenda gasped, taking a step back as if I had physically struck her, her hands flying to her chest. "That is enough," Tyrone boomed, stepping in front of Brenda in a desperate attempt to assert a patriarchal authority he had surrendered years ago. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at my face. "You are going to fix this, Maya. Right now. You are going to march back downstairs, find Harrison Davenport, and tell him those files were a misunderstanding. You are going to tell him that our finances are secure and that the Washington family name is untarnished." I stared at him, genuinely fascinated by the sheer magnitude of his delusion. "Tell him it was a misunderstanding, Tyrone. The bank is foreclosing on your house in 14 days. You have 3 mortgages, $40,000 in back taxes, and $4,000 in your checking account. That is not a misunderstanding. That is bankruptcy. Harrison is a billionaire corporate auditor. You cannot gaslight a spreadsheet." Tyrone's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He took another step forward, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, looming over the sideboard. "If you do not fix this with the Davenports, I will ruin you," Tyrone threatened, his voice dropping to a gravelly snarl. "You think you are so untouchable in your ivory tower? You think your little corporate merger is safe? I will go directly to the press. I will call the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, every business reporter in the city. I will tell them that the CEO of Apex Medical Solutions is a sociopath. I will tell them you defrauded your own family, that you manipulated documents, and that you are mentally unstable. I will tank your Vanguard acquisition before the market even opens on Monday." The room fell dead silent. Brenda looked at Tyrone with a flicker of desperate hope, genuinely believing her husband had just played a winning hand. They expected me to panic. They expected me to back down, terrified of a public relations scandal on the eve of a massive corporate buyout. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, unlocked the screen, and held it out toward him. "Go ahead," I said, my voice ringing with cold, absolute certainty. Tyrone blinked, his outstretched finger faltering. "What?" "Take the phone." "Tyrone, call them." I offered, stepping closer to him, closing the distance until he was forced to look directly into my eyes. "Call the Wall Street Journal. I have the managing editor of the tech sector on speed dial. Do you want me to dial the number for you?" Tyrone stared at the phone, swallowing hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He did not move a single muscle. "Let me explain how the real world works." I continued, my tone slicing through the room like a scalpel. "To destroy someone in the press, you need credibility. You have absolutely none. You are an insolvent, unemployed grifter with 7 maxed-out credit cards and a pending foreclosure. I am a federally audited CEO closing a multi-million-dollar merger. Do you honestly believe a financial reporter is going to take the word of a bankrupt con artist over verified SEC filings? They will laugh you out of the newsroom." Tyrone's hand slowly dropped to his side. The color was draining from his face as the absolute futility of his threat washed over him. "But please, I urge you to go to the press," I whispered, stepping even closer, forcing him to back away. "Because the second you make my name public, I will not respond with a press release. I will respond with a police report. I will hand the forged power of attorney documents and the wire transfer receipts directly to the district attorney. If you say one single word to the media, the authorities will not be investigating me for corporate instability. They will be arresting you and Brenda for federal wire fraud and the theft of a $250,000 trust fund." Brenda let out a quiet, terrified whimper, covering her mouth with her hand. The aggressive, entitled matriarch had vanished, replaced by a woman staring at the very real possibility of a prison sentence. "You have less than 2 hours until your daughter walks down the aisle," I said, turning away from them and picking up my glass of water. "If I were you, I would stop worrying about my company and start figuring out how you are going to pay the catering staff. Harrison Davenport has closed his checkbook, your stolen funds are completely gone, and this estate does not operate on charity." I took a sip of my water, my eyes locked on them over the rim of the crystal glass. "Get out of my room, and do not ever attempt to threaten me again." Tyrone turned toward the heavy mahogany door, his bravado entirely deflated. He was ready to flee the room and the consequences of his own hubris. Brenda grabbed his arm, her eyes darting nervously toward the exit. They genuinely thought the execution was over. They thought they could just walk away, regroup, and figure out another angle to manipulate the Davenports. I was not going to let them breathe. "Stop exactly where you are," I commanded. The absolute authority in my voice froze them in their tracks. I reached into my leather briefcase resting on the nearby armchair. I pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. My corporate investigator had delivered it by secure courier yesterday morning. It contained the complete, unredacted financial history of the Washington family over the last 8 years. I walked over to the glass coffee table in the center of the room and slammed the stack of papers down. The heavy thud echoed off the floral wallpaper, sealing their fate. "Look at them," I demanded, tapping the highlighted rows on the top page. "I want you to look at the exact cost of your delusions. Those are the bank records from my late mother's irrevocable trust. The trust she explicitly set up for my education and my future. The trust you claimed was decimated by market fluctuations when I needed it to survive." Tyrone swallowed hard, his eyes refusing to meet the documents. He raised a shaking hand, trying to formulate a defense. "Maya, you do not understand how complicated estate taxes are. The market was volatile and we had to make administrative transfers to protect the principal balance." I picked up the first page and held it directly in front of his face. "I understand embezzlement perfectly well, Tyrone. Look at the date. August 12th, 4 years ago. A wire transfer of $45,000 from the trust directly into your personal checking account. That was exactly 2 days before Chloe posted pictures of her brand new imported luxury sedan on social media." Brenda let out a small, strangled noise, her manicured hands fluttering uselessly near her throat. I dropped the paper and picked up the next one. October 3rd, 3 years ago. Another withdrawal. $60,000. Strangely, that perfectly aligns with the massive down payment on the European villa rental you used to impress Julian's family during your first summer vacation together. I slammed the paper back down onto the glass. You did not just abandon me, Tyrone. You stole from me to dress her up. You literally financed your golden child's fake billionaire aesthetic with my dead mother's money. I was so focused on the absolute terror washing over Brenda's face that I did not notice the heavy mahogany door swinging open further. Mom, Dad. The voice was fragile, trembling with a mixture of panic and confusion. I turned. Chloe stood in the doorway. She was wearing her custom designer wedding gown, but the intricate lace back was entirely unzipped, the heavy silk pooling slightly around her waist. Her mascara was smudged beneath her eyes, a clear indicator of the crying fit she had just thrown in the bridal suite after signing Julian's prenup. She looked like a broken porcelain doll. But Chloe was not alone. Standing directly behind her in the wide corridor, casting long shadows into the guest suite, were Julian and Harrison Davenport. Julian's expression was a mask of cold, controlled fury. Harrison stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with the calculating gaze of a predator observing cornered prey. They had heard everything, every date, every dollar amount, every accusation of theft. Chloe stared at the papers on the glass table, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. "What is she talking about, Dad?" Chloe asked, her voice cracking. "What trust fund? You told me my car was a graduation gift. You told me the villa was a company write-off." Tyrone opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked from his daughter to the two billionaires standing in the hallway, realizing that the walls of his carefully constructed lies were collapsing inward, crushing him completely. Brenda rushed towards the door, trying to block Chloe's view of the documents. "Chloe, sweetheart, do not listen to her. Maya is just trying to cause trouble. She fabricated these documents to ruin your day because she is jealous. We need to get you back to the suite. Your hair is a mess and the photographer is waiting." Harrison stepped forward, his mere presence silencing Brenda instantly. The billionaire walked past Chloe, stepping into my guest suite with the authority of a man who owned everything he surveyed. He approached the glass coffee table, picked up the highlighted bank statements, and pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket. He reviewed the documents with terrifying speed, his eyes scanning the routing numbers, the dates, and the authorization signatures. "This is federal wire fraud," Harrison stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "And given the amount, it is a felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence. The paper trail is irrefutable." Julian stepped into the room, standing beside his father. He looked at Chloe, the woman he had been prepared to marry in less than 2 hours. His eyes trailed over the extravagant silk and lace of her gown, the diamond earrings sparkling against her neck, the pristine white orchids pinned into her hair. "My mother's money paid for that dress," I stated clearly, ensuring the physical reality of the theft was impossible to ignore. "My mother's money paid for the deposit on this venue. Every piece of shrimp being served downstairs, every crystal champagne flute, every white orchid in the ballroom. It was all bought with stolen funds. You are literally wearing my inheritance, Chloe." Chloe let out a devastated sob, gripping the wooden doorframe to keep herself from collapsing. "Julian, please," she begged, reaching a trembling hand out toward him. "I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know where the money came from. I thought my dad was successful. I thought we were wealthy. You have to believe me." Julian looked at her outstretched hand, but he did not move a single inch to comfort her. "Whether you knew about the theft or not is irrelevant, Chloe." Julian said, his voice as cold and hard as ice. "You knew your parents were broke. You knew they were facing foreclosure, and you lied to my face about it this morning. You let me believe we were equals while your family was actively plotting to use my bank accounts to pay off their stolen debts. You smiled at me while facilitating a financial crime." "Julian, we love each other." Chloe pleaded, fresh tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive bridal makeup. "The money does not matter. We can fix this. We can pay her back." "It matters when the foundation of our entire relationship is a criminal enterprise," Julian snapped. He turned to Tyrone and Brenda, his disgust palpable, radiating from him in waves. "You disgust me, both of you. You paraded around my family's homes, drank our wine, and treated my staff like servants, all while funding your masquerade with a stolen inheritance. You are nothing but common thieves. Harrison placed the bank statements back onto the glass table, aligning the edges perfectly. The precision of the movement was terrifying. "The wedding is officially canceled," Harrison announced. The words rang out with absolute crushing finality. "I will instruct my security team to begin clearing the guests from the ballroom immediately." Brenda let out a wailing, agonizing cry, collapsing onto the velvet sofa, her face buried in her hands, as her entire social standing evaporated. Tyrone stood paralyzed, his eyes wide and vacant, as the reality of his complete destruction set in. He was no longer a wealthy developer. He was a criminal waiting for an indictment. "But what about the vendors?" Tyrone whispered, his voice barely audible, shaking with terror. "We owe the caterers the final payment today, the florists, the event planners. We do not have the money to pay them if the wedding does not happen." "That sounds like a personal problem," Tyrone Harrison replied smoothly, adjusting his cuffs. "I suggest you contact a bankruptcy attorney immediately. You will certainly need one after my legal team forwards these bank records to the district attorney's office on Monday morning." Chloe slid down the doorframe, sinking to the floor in her half-zipped wedding dress, sobbing uncontrollably. The golden child, the perfect daughter, who had been handed everything on a silver platter, was now sitting in a crumpled heap of stolen silk, her future entirely obliterated. I stood quietly by the sideboard, watching the Washington family face the absolute ruin they had spent a decade building. They had branded me a failure, an ugly dropout, who would never amount to anything. They had tried to banish me to the shadows so they could shine in the spotlight. But the spotlight had just burned their entire world to ash. Harrison turned to me, offering a curt, highly respectful nod. "I apologize for the disruption to your weekend, Maya. My security director will ensure these three are escorted off the premises within the next 15 minutes. If you require any legal assistance in recovering your stolen trust funds, Davenport Healthcare's legal department is at your absolute disposal." "Thank you, Harrison," I replied, matching his professional tone. "I believe my own corporate legal team has it well in hand." Julian cast one final lingering look at the sobbing woman on the floor before turning on his heel and walking out of the suite. Harrison followed him, leaving the heavy mahogany door wide open. The silence they left behind was heavy, broken only by the pathetic sound of Brenda and Chloe weeping over the ruins of their scam. I picked up the bank statements from the table, tapped them against the glass to align the edges, and slid them back into the manila envelope. The execution was complete. The fraudulent empire had fallen. Julian did not disappear down the grand corridor. His footsteps slowed, echoing sharply against the imported Italian marble before coming to a complete halt. He stood with his back to the room for 5 agonizing seconds. The heavy silence of the guest suite was broken only by Chloe's pathetic, gasping sobs as she knelt on the floor in her half-zipped designer gown. Julian turned slowly. The easygoing, affable heir to the Davenport empire was gone, replaced by a man whose aristocratic features were hardened into carved stone. He walked back to the threshold of the open mahogany doors. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out the thick, revised prenuptial agreement he had brought upstairs earlier. He held the heavy stack of legal documents in his hand, staring down at the woman he had believed was his equal. The illusion was permanently shattered. There was no longer a beautiful, wealthy heiress kneeling before him. There was only a desperate, insolvent fraud who had built her entire relationship on a foundation of stolen money and calculated lies. Julian looked at Chloe with absolute, unadulterated disgust. He opened his hand and let the thick stack of papers fall. The heavy document hit the plush carpet with a dull, final thud. "The reception is over," Julian announced, his voice ringing with a cold, terrifying authority. "My father is downstairs right now, informing the wedding planner to pack up the ballroom. I am telling the catering staff to send the food to a local shelter. The guests are being told to go home." Chloe let out a visceral shriek, scrambling forward on her knees. Her hands grasped desperately at the perfectly creased fabric of his trousers. "No, Julian. Please, you cannot do this. The guests are already arriving. We can fix this. We can explain it." Julian looked down at her grasping hands and took a deliberate step backward, forcing her to let go. He adjusted his jacket, his expression completely devoid of pity. "I am not explaining anything to anyone," Julian stated, his tone flat and unyielding. "Your parents stole $250,000 from your own sister to lease luxury cars and rent villas so you could trick me into marrying you. There is no explaining that away." He paused, letting the crushing reality of his words settle over the room. However, Julian continued, his eyes narrowing into a sharp, testing glare. "You spent the last hour crying and swearing that you love me for who I am, not for my family's money. You swore that the Davenport fortune meant absolutely nothing to you." Chloe nodded frantically, fresh tears carving tracks through her expensive foundation. "I do. I swear I do. I love you, Julian. I do not care about the money." "Perfect," Julian replied smoothly, delivering the ultimate test. "Because there will be no Davenport bailout for your parents. We are not paying their mortgages. We are not paying their back taxes. We are not covering the remaining balance for this venue. They are completely on their own." He pointed to the discarded prenuptial agreement on the floor. "If you actually love me, Chloe, and this was not just a decade-long grift, then you will meet me at the downtown courthouse on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. We will sign that exact document in front of a judge, waiving your right to a single dime of my family's assets, and we will get married quietly. Just the two of us. No reception, no press, no payout." Julian held her gaze for 3 seconds, waiting for her response. Chloe's mouth opened, but no words came out. The frantic, desperate pleading suddenly died in her throat. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She was not just losing the lavish wedding, she was losing the financial rescue package her family required to avoid absolute destitution. Meeting him at a courthouse with an ironclad prenup meant she would have to face her family's bankruptcy anyway. Her silence was the only answer Julian needed. A dark, bitter laugh escaped his lips. "That is exactly what I thought," he whispered. "Do not ever contact me again." Julian turned on his heel and strode down the corridor, disappearing down the sweeping staircase. He did not look back. Chloe collapsed completely. Her body hit the floor and she descended into absolute primal hysterics. She screamed, her fists pounding against the carpet, tearing at the expensive lace of her wedding dress. The golden child's entire universe had just been vaporized. The billionaire lifestyle, the high society connections, the unearned prestige. All of it was gone, replaced by the impending reality of eviction notices and empty bank accounts. Tyrone stood frozen by the sideboard, his face gray, his jaw slack as he stared blankly at his sobbing daughter. The patriarchal illusion he had maintained for years was entirely broken. He was a ruined man. But Brenda could not accept defeat. The realization that her carefully orchestrated master plan had just been detonated by her scapegoat daughter pushed her over the edge into sheer violent madness. Her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. The veins in her neck bulged against her pearl necklace. "You!" Brenda roared, spinning toward me. "You did this! You ruined her life!" She lunged across the guest suite, her hand raised high, aiming a vicious, open-palmed slap directly at my face. She wanted to physically strike me down to assert the physical dominance she had used to terrorize me when I was a teenager living under her roof. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I had spent the last 5 years building a multi-million-dollar technology firm in the most cutthroat corporate environments on the planet. I had crushed hostile takeovers and neutralized aggressive board members. A desperate, aging grifter was not going to lay a hand on me. My left arm shot up with lightning speed. I caught Brenda's wrist midair, mere inches from my cheek. My grip was like a steel vise. I dug my fingers into her pulse point, stopping her forward momentum entirely. Brenda gasped, her eyes widening in sudden panicked shock as she tried to yank her arm back. I did not let go. I held her wrist suspended between us, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "Do not ever raise your hand to me again," I commanded, my voice dropping to a lethal, freezing whisper. "You are not in control here, Brenda. You lost the moment you decided to steal from a woman who builds forensic data algorithms for a living." Brenda struggled, her breathing ragged. "Let go of me. You are a monster. You destroyed your own sister's wedding because you are bitter and jealous." I released her wrist with a sharp shove, forcing her to stumble backward into Tyrone's chest. I smoothed the lapel of my ivory suit, radiating an absolute terrifying calm. I did not destroy anything, I stated coldly. I simply provided the auditing data. You destroyed yourselves the minute you initiated a fraudulent wire transfer across state lines. Tyrone stepped up, holding his trembling wife by the shoulders. You got what you wanted, Maya. He stammered, his voice weak and defeated. The wedding is off. Julian is gone. Are you happy now? Just take your documents and leave us alone. I let out a slow, deliberate breath, shaking my head slightly. I reached over to the glass coffee table, picked up my leather briefcase, and snapped the brass lock shut. You still do not understand the magnitude of your situation, Tyrone, I said, looking at the three ruined figures huddled in the center of the room. This was never just about stopping a wedding. This was about recovering stolen assets and neutralizing a threat. You thought I was bluffing earlier when I mentioned the authorities. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked the screen. I looked back up at Brenda, my expression entirely devoid of mercy. My corporate legal team did not just compile those bank statements for Harrison Davenport. I informed them, my voice echoing clinically in the quiet room. They compiled them for the district attorney. Exactly 1 hour ago, while you were drinking champagne and adjusting Chloe's veil, my attorneys officially filed felony fraud and embezzlement charges against both of you. Brenda's knees buckled. She let out a strangled, breathless wheeze, clutching Tyrone's suit jacket to keep from hitting the floor. Chloe stopped screaming, her head snapping up, her tear-streaked face staring at me in absolute horror. What? Tyrone gasped, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Maya, no, you cannot do this. We are family. We share genetics. We are not family, I corrected sharply. You stole $250,000 from a protected trust. That is grand larceny. Because you transferred those funds electronically between different banking institutions, it triggers federal wire fraud statutes. You are not just facing bankruptcy, Tyrone. You are facing a mandatory minimum prison sentence in a federal facility. I picked up my briefcase by the leather handle and walked slowly toward the open mahogany doors. I stopped right next to where Chloe sat frozen on the carpet. The police are not going to call you to negotiate, I added, looking down at Brenda's trembling gray face. Warrants are being drawn up right now. I highly suggest you use whatever credit you have left on your maxed-out cards to hire a criminal defense attorney. Because when the authorities arrive, your fake billionaire aesthetic will not keep you out of handcuffs. I did not wait for their response. I stepped out of the guest suite and pulled the heavy door shut behind me, the solid click of the latch serving as the final punctuation mark on their destruction. As I walked down the grand sweeping staircase of the botanical estate, the true scale of the devastation was visible. The string quartet was packing up their instruments. Event staff were silently folding up rows of golden chairs and dismantling the towering archways of white orchids. The extravagant, fraudulent fantasy was being systematically erased. I walked out the front doors, stepped into the crisp afternoon air, and signaled for my driver. The execution was flawless. The vengeance was absolute, and my future was completely my own. I did not stay to watch the fallout in the bridal suite. The execution was complete, but I still had to collect my belongings from the guest wing of the estate. I walked back down the plush, carpeted hallway to my assigned room, the heavy silence of the corridor standing in stark, beautiful contrast to the muffled, hysterical sobbing echoing from the room I had just left. Once inside my suite, I moved with calm, deliberate efficiency. The adrenaline that had fueled the confrontation in the boardroom was fading, replaced by a deep, settling sense of absolute peace. I folded my silk blouses, placed my cosmetics into their leather case, and secured my laptop and the physical copies of the bank statements inside my briefcase. I zipped my overnight bag shut. The metallic sound was sharp, final, and incredibly satisfying. Through the window of my suite, I could see the caterers loading trays of untouched caviar and crystal champagne flutes back into their pristine white trucks. The grand botanical estate, which just hours ago had been the stage for the Washington family's ultimate triumph, was now the site of their absolute ruin. The floral arches were being dismantled. The string quartet was packing away their cellos. The extravagant, fraudulent fantasy was being systematically erased from reality. I slipped into my tailored trench coat, grabbed my bags, and stepped out of the suite for the final time. As I descended the grand sweeping staircase toward the main lobby, the collateral damage of Chloe's shattered wedding was on full display. Wealthy guests in tailored suits and designer gowns were standing in confused, whispering clusters near the valet stand. The Davenport security team was efficiently but firmly directing people toward the exits. There was no music. There was no celebration. There was only the uncomfortable, palpable tension of a high society scandal unfolding in real time. I could hear snippets of conversation as I walked past the velvet ropes. Words like wire fraud canceled and bankruptcy were drifting through the crowd like smoke. I reached the marble foyer. Through the massive glass doors, I saw my hired black car pulling up to the curb, the driver stepping out to open the trunk. I was 3 steps away from the exit when I heard the frantic, heavy slapping of footsteps on the marble behind me. Maya. Maya, wait. Please. I stopped, my hand hovering inches from the brass door handle. I turned slowly. Tyrone was rushing across the lobby. He looked entirely unrecognizable. The custom-tailored tuxedo he had worn with such arrogant pride just an hour ago was rumpled, the bow tie hanging loosely around his neck. His face was blotchy, his eyes bloodshot and wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. He was sweating profusely, taking ragged, gasping breaths as he closed the distance between us. He stopped a few feet away, holding up his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Tears were actually streaming down his cheeks, catching in the deep creases of his face. The patriarch of the Washington family, the man who had spent a decade treating me like a disposable nuisance, was weeping in the middle of a crowded lobby. Maya, please, you have to call off the lawyers. Tyrone begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, reedy whine. You have to stop the police. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever you need me to sign. Just tell them it was a mistake. Tell them we had permission to move the funds. We can pay you back. I swear we will figure out a way to pay you back. I stared at him, my expression entirely devoid of sympathy. The sheer audacity of the man was staggering. You committed federal wire fraud, Tyrone, I stated, my voice cold and flat. You stole $250,000 from a protected trust. I cannot call off the federal government because you are suddenly afraid of the consequences. The bank records are already in the hands of the district attorney. It was Brenda, Tyrone blurted out, stepping closer. His voice dropped to a frantic, desperate whisper. It was all Brenda. She managed the accounts. She set up the transfers. You know how she is, Maya. You know how she demands things. She said we needed the money to keep up appearances for Julian's family. I did not want to take your mother's money. I swear to you, I did not know how bad the theft was until the bank sent the foreclosure notice. She manipulated the finances. She hid the statements from me. I looked at him with absolute freezing disgust. I watched a man throw his wife of 30 years directly under a bus to save his own skin. He was willing to let the mother of his golden child take the entirety of a federal fraud charge if it meant he could avoid a prison cell. You are a coward, I said, my voice echoing clearly against the marble walls, drawing the eyes of several lingering guests. You did not seem to mind Brenda's financial management when you were driving a leased Mercedes you could not afford. You did not mind when you were drinking vintage wine on the terrace of a rented European villa. You gladly spent my mother's money to build this fake, hollow life. And now that the bill has come due, you want to pretend you were just a helpless bystander. Tyrone's face crumpled. He actually sank to his knees, his expensive trousers hitting the hard marble floor. He reached out, trying to grab the hem of my coat. Maya, I raised you. You cannot let them send me to prison. I will not survive it. Please. I am begging you. Look at me. I am begging you for mercy. I stepped back, pulling my coat out of his reach. The sight of him kneeling there did not evoke a single ounce of pity. It only confirmed what I had known since the day they threw me out of their house. They were parasites. They fed on whoever was convenient, and they expected loyalty from the very people they abused. I looked down at the weeping, broken man on the floor. I thought back to every holiday dinner where I was pushed to the periphery of the room. I remembered the night I dropped out of the nursing program when he had stood on the porch and watched Brenda throw my belongings into the rain. I remembered the smirk on his face 5 years ago when they hosted a lavish dinner party paid for with my stolen inheritance, and he had literally pointed to the door, telling me I did not belong at their table because I was a failure. The wheel had finally turned. The power dynamic was permanently and irreversibly inverted. I leaned down slightly, making sure my words were perfectly clear, delivered with the cold, lethal precision of a judge handing down a final sentence. "Go find another table, Tyrone," I whispered, my voice completely dead. "You are not my family anymore." I straightened up, turned my back on him, and pushed open the heavy glass doors. The crisp, cool air hit my face, clearing away the suffocating toxicity of the estate. My driver took my bags, securing them in the trunk before opening the rear door for me. I stepped into the quiet, leather-scented interior of the black car. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly down the long, tree-lined driveway, I did not look back. I did not watch the flashing red and blue lights of the approaching police cruisers as they passed us in the opposite direction, speeding toward the grand entrance to execute the felony warrants. The Washington family was trapped in the wreckage of their own making, burying themselves under the weight of their greed and arrogance. I leaned back against the headrest, watching the sprawling estate disappear in the rearview mirror. The long, exhausting war was finally over. I had reclaimed my mother's legacy, neutralized the people who had tried to destroy me, and secured my own future. The grifters had lost everything, and I had won. 6 months later, the crisp autumn wind swept across the wraparound terrace of my new penthouse, carrying with it the ambient hum of the city far below. I stood near the glass railing, holding a crystal glass of vintage Cabernet Sauvignon, the deep red liquid catching the ambient light of the skyline. The view from 40 stories up was spectacular, a sprawling ocean of neon and steel that stretched out to the horizon. It was a tangible, monumental representation of everything I had built with my own two hands. The contrast between this serene, untouchable peace and the frantic, pathetic chaos I had walked away from 6 months ago was profound. The legal machinery I had set into motion on the day of that disastrous aborted wedding had ground the Washington family into fine dust. They had expected me to relent. They had genuinely believed that after a few weeks of silence, the traditional bonds of familial obligation would override my desire for justice. They thought I would call my corporate attorneys, drop the investigation, and offer them a lifeline. They were catastrophically mistaken. Exactly 14 days after Julian Davenport walked out of that guest suite, the bank finalized the foreclosure on the Washington estate. The sheriffs arrived on a Tuesday morning, executing the eviction and forcing Tyrone and Brenda onto the curb with nothing but the clothes they could fit into a few hastily packed suitcases. There were no country club friends waiting to offer them a guest house. There were no wealthy relatives willing to open their doors. Their meticulously curated social circle vanished the second the financial scandal hit the local news cycle. But losing the house was merely the opening act of their destruction. The district attorney did not view the theft of a $250,000 trust fund as a simple family dispute. They viewed it exactly as it was: federal wire fraud and grand larceny. Brenda and Tyrone were formally indicted. They were currently residing in a low-rent weekly motel on the outskirts of the city, awaiting their criminal trial. Their passports had been seized. Their assets, what little remained of them, were frozen pending the ongoing federal investigation. Tyrone had attempted to reach out to me exactly once, leaving a rambling, tearful voicemail begging for a character reference. I forwarded the recording directly to the prosecuting attorney and blocked his number permanently. Chloe's descent into reality had been arguably more brutal, primarily because she had orchestrated her own final humiliation. Driven by sheer desperation and the delusional belief that she could still manipulate her way into the Davenport fortune, Chloe actually showed up at the downtown courthouse on that following Monday morning. She stood in front of a municipal judge wearing a conservative dress and signed the ironclad, updated prenuptial agreement Julian had presented to her. She legally waived her right to every single dime of the Davenport empire, banking on the arrogant assumption that once they were legally bound, Julian would soften and revert to his role as her financial savior. Julian married her. He secured his family's assets. And then, less than 72 hours later, his legal team filed for an immediate annulment on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. He had never intended to stay married to her. He had only wanted to ensure that she signed a legally binding document proving she had entered the marriage under false pretenses, completely neutralizing any potential claim for spousal support or palimony. He evicted her from his luxury condominium the same day the annulment papers were filed. Today, the former golden child, the woman who had spent a decade mocking my education and my ambitions, was working a minimum wage retail job at a mid-tier department store. She spent her days folding sweaters and organizing clearance racks just to afford a room in a shared apartment. There were no more imported luxury sedans. There were no more European villa vacations financed by stolen inheritance money. There was only the grinding, exhausting reality of the working-class life she had always believed she was too beautiful and too important to endure. I took a slow, savoring sip of my wine, letting the rich flavor coat my palate. Behind me, the floor-to-ceiling glass doors slid open, allowing the warm, ambient sound of laughter and clinking silverware to spill out onto the chilly terrace. I turned to look inside my dining room. The massive mahogany table was set for 12, illuminated by the soft glow of a modern crystal chandelier. This was my family now. Seated at the head of the table was Marcus, my lead developer, who had spent countless sleepless nights coding alongside me in our cramped startup office years ago. Next to him was Sarah, my corporate investigator, the brilliant woman who had tracked down the offshore accounts and unraveled Brenda's embezzlement scheme with lethal precision. Across from them sat my mentors, my earliest investors, and the genuine friends who had supported me when I had absolutely nothing. They were not related to me by blood. We did not share genetics. But they had shown me more loyalty, more respect, and more authentic love than the Washingtons ever had. They did not view me as a resource to be drained or a scapegoat to be utilized. They viewed me as their equal, their leader, and their friend. The acquisition of Apex Medical Solutions had finalized smoothly 2 months ago. The 9-figure valuation had officially elevated me into a financial stratosphere that Tyrone and Brenda could not even comprehend, let alone access. I was completely independent. I possessed generational wealth that I had created from scratch, and I had surrounded myself with a titanium wall of legal and physical security. "Hey, boss," Marcus called out from the dining room, raising his glass of champagne toward the terrace. "You are missing the best part of the catered dessert. Get in here before Sarah eats your slice. I am coming." I called back, a genuine, unburdened smile breaking across my face. I turned back to the skyline for one final moment. The city below was a labyrinth of millions of lives, millions of struggles, and millions of stories. For the first 22 years of my life, my story had been dictated by people who fundamentally despised me. They had tried to write me as the villain, the failure, the ugly dropout who would fade into obscurity while they basked in stolen glory. They had severely underestimated the girl they threw out into the rain. I raised my glass of wine toward the glittering horizon, offering a silent, solitary toast to the empire I had built and the parasites I had successfully severed from my life. I was no longer fighting for a seat at a table where I was not wanted. I owned the entire building. I turned my back on the cold night air, stepped inside my penthouse, and closed the heavy glass doors. I walked toward the warmth of my chosen family, wealthy, untouchable, and finally completely free. The ultimate lesson here is that blood does not automatically equate to family. When toxic relatives disguise manipulation and theft as familial obligation, your greatest defense is absolute independence. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep abusive people warm. Real empowerment comes from walking away from tables where your worth is constantly disrespected and building your own empire instead. Success forged through resilience and self-respect is always the sweetest justice against those who tried to bury you. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your story below and subscribe for more.